So some of you have asked me why it took me 2 years to take up the family business. Dad had been a member of Camber & Sons logging outfit since I was born, and it should have been easy to get a job with them. Dad would have likely been overjoyed to have me come to work with him, but I had other ideas. I, like many others before me, had tried to escape Rayffered as soon as I was able. After 3 years of ROTC and nearly constant pushing to get the credits I needed, I was eligible for early graduation. I would turn 18 in May, a few weeks after school ended for the year, and I took the opportunity to move on to the next stage of my life. With my grades, my ASVAB score, and participation in ROTC, I was also offered an invitation to join the Army, and I left on a 2-year tour of duty after basic. This was during a time when the armed forces were still heavily entrenched in the Middle East, and I took up my rifle and had soon forgotten about foresters and Rayffered and the concerns of my childhood. I was going out with my unit every day, patrolling and securing sites, but it appeared that my childhood hadn't quite forgotten about me. About a week after I turned 20, the dreams started. I was back in Rayffered, standing amidst the fog. I was 10 years old, sitting on the pavement and shuddering in fear. This time, there wasn't just one forester, though. There were hundreds. They came shambling out of the fog, scraping the pavement and groaning as their bodies twisted and writhed. They surrounded me, ringing me in as they pushed closer and closer. One of them shambled his way to the front, his form obscured by the fog, but I felt like I knew who it was. There was only one person it could be for me, and as they leered at me from the depths of the miasma, I would come awake fitfully, sometimes waking up my fellow bunkmates. It would take a week of inadequate sleep before the strain finally got to me, and it ended up saving my life. I was driving through the pitted streets of Fallujah, my unit heading to investigate a couple of suspected gathering places for rebel rousers, when someone ran across the road. What I saw was a gangling kid in blue shorts with a backwards cap, a kid who looked a lot like my brother had before being drug off, and when I turned the wheel to avoid him, everything went white before going black for a little while. We had hit an incendiary device buried by insurgents, but we hadn't hit it square. We had clipped it in our haste, and it had flipped the Humvee we'd been riding in. We'd been rolled into a nearby ditch. Briggs, the medic on board, had called for support, and only me and a couple of others had been injured at all. I'd taken a hit to the head when it slammed into the side of a door, and the docs thought I might have brain damage. That and the explosion left me in the hospital for a few weeks, and when someone from HR came to speak with me, I knew it wasn't good. The medics say you have something going on after the crash. It isn't life-threatening, but they don't know how a combat situation would affect it. Your quick thinking might have possibly saved the lives of your squad, and the brass is willing to reward that. They want to offer you a medical discharge with full compensation. This'll get you your service benefits and the same care as a 4-year enlistee. They also want to offer you a Medal of Valor for what you did out there. I don't know how you feel about your service career, but I think you'd be a fool not to accept it. So they offered me a Medal of Valor for nearly falling asleep at the wheel and swerving to avoid a hallucination. My squad thought I had seen nothing in the road, but they all thought it had been a lump or a divot that didn't look right. None of them had seen anyone dart out across the street, and when I suggested it, they told me to stop being modest. The other 2 injured soldiers were discharged pretty quick, and I packed my stuff and prepared to go home. After the dreams and seeing my older brother in a foreign land, I was pretty sure I could take these things as a sign that something wanted me back in Rayffered. Given my dreams, I wasn't sure it was an invitation I wanted to accept. But I returned to Rayffered anyway, and the town rolled out the red carpet for me. Rayffered is a town of about 55,000, and they don't have a lot of heroes. Well, other than the brave loggers who head into the forest every day, knowing what lives there. It was weird to come back to a place I had thought I'd left behind, especially as a hero of sorts. I had looked at the statue of the 2 guys who died in Korea about 100 times as a kid. It was weird to think that I might be on their level. Rayffered had mostly been immune to wars ever since the Civil War, and the few who had been enlisted hadn't really made much of an impression. Then the Talbot twins had enlisted to go to Korea. They had died heroically, holding a hill in an unpronounceable province for 6 days. They nearly lasted till reinforcements arrived, but the chopper found them both dead in the gun nest they occupied. The town had memorialized them in granite, and it was strange to be counted amongst them. I spent my first week walking around like a celebrity. My old high school friends who still lived in town invited me to parties. People paid for my meals at restaurants. I was treated better than I had been in years, but just because I was home didn't mean that the dreams stopped. If anything, they only got worse. I was no longer sitting on the hot top and waiting for the foresters. No, I was hoofing it through a war zone. My gun was heavy. My undershirt stuck to me from beneath my flak jacket. But the enemies that reared up were the creaking shades of the foresters. The wooded bits of them seemed to writhe behind the standing smog that permeated everything. No matter how many times I shot them, they always seemed to pop back up. I would always wake up just as a familiar shape rose up behind the smog, the barrel shaking as I came awake. I didn't know what to make of them until Friday night found me at a party. My friend Frank was throwing a house party, and he couldn't think of anyone better to have there but a genuine war hero. "You'll be there, right?" he said, and it was pretty clear that he had told people I would be. Friday night saw me sitting in his parents' kitchen, drinking a lukewarm beer and talking with people that I hadn't seen in 3 years. Most of them had either never left or had never been farther from the city limits than a few hours. I was honestly finding it hard to relate to them. The more people I talked to, the more I questioned why I was still here at all. Was this my life now? Living with my parents and working some dead-end job in a town that was shrinking yearly as the forest threatened to reclaim it? I smiled at my old friends and laughed at their stories or commiserated with their losses, but I was honestly debating taking my house budget and going anywhere but Rayffered. Then, someone put a hand on my shoulder, and I looked up to see the last person I had expected. "Haven't seen you in a while, Rambo. Glad you made it back alive." It was Tyler, and his smile looked as hollow as my own. We sat around and talked a lot that night as bottles piled up, and we both shared a little more than we meant to. Tyler had been struggling since high school. His dad's grocery store was doing well, but Tyler wasn't ready to take it from him. The decision, however, seemed to be out of his hands. The doctors had told his dad he had cancer a few months ago, the kind that creeps in fast and doesn't leave a lot of time for goodbyes. His dad was stage 3 now, practically sprinting to the finish line, and Dr. John had given him weeks instead of months. The shit of it is that Dad never smoked, never did any of the things that usually lead to cancer. So when he started looking into how he had contracted such an aggressive type, they found it was the chemicals on the vegetables that he stocked from the local farms. They'd been spraying their produce with something to get rid of the wood beetles, and Dad had been coming into contact with it for years. The business literally killed him, and now he wants me to take it up. How do I tell my old man as he lays dying that I don't want to take up a mantle that put him in an early grave? I didn't have any answers for him, and we both just sat there in silence as people milled about us. Times like this make me think about Simon. I looked away, not sure when we were going to come to this topic of my brother. I still feel guilty about that day. I keep wondering what I could have done to nothing. I cut in. There's nothing you could have done. I've told you this for years. It was a fluke. There isn't anything anyone could have done. Suddenly it was all too much. The crowd, the music, the sea of familiar faces that suddenly swam together in a sea of booze. It was all too much. I had planned to crash at Frank's after the party, the rules of the town still applying to heroes, but I just couldn't. I got up, heading for the door, when Tyler called my name and told me the foresters would get me if I went out. I've spent 3 years in an active war zone, Tyler. I think I can make it home in one piece in a town I grew up in. No one seemed to notice as I walked out the door, and it wasn't until I started walking through the night that I began to think better of it. The night was quiet, not a bat or a night bird making a single noise, and it felt a little claustrophobic. Even in the desert there had been noise, but this almost felt like a truly foreign place. The wind pushed at the trees, the sudden intrusion of the skeletal brush across the concrete as unwelcome as the silence. I was about halfway home when the overwhelming urge to empty my bladder hit, and I was forced to find a bush along the side of the road. I was beginning to sober up, starting to worry that maybe I'd been a little too brash, when I noticed the fog rolling in around my ankles. I tried to hurry, wanting to hurry up so as to keep moving, but I drank about a 10-pack all by myself, and when I zipped up and turned around, I was back in the fog bank. The mist was thick as it swirled around me, leaving me alone in the haze. As I watched, something shadowy moved amidst the fog, and I tried my best to stand completely still. I wasn't 10 anymore, and I meant to fight if this thing wanted me. I wouldn't be the first adult to go missing thanks to the foresters. It wasn't the huge group I'd expected, though, but a single forester, like the dreams I'd been having recently. As it moved, I got none of the usual apprehension I'd had when I was young. The forester wasn't as old, wasn't as degraded as the others, and its gait was unmarred by haste or hunger or whatever it was that moved them. The soft clump of wood on the road, however, was enough to tell me that some parts of it were less than natural. I stayed completely still as it came closer and closer, the mist obscuring all but its dark outline. Would it lunge and take me in a tackle? Would it disappear at the last minute and leave me trembling in the mist that I had been in when I was younger? Was it distracting me so another one could creep up behind me and get me? I didn't dare take my eyes off to look. I just watched as it came within 5 easy feet of me, knowing who it was before it uttered a single word. "Old Grove," it creaked. Its voice was like pines bending in the wind. "Simon?" I half whispered, and the thing stiffened as if it had heard something from a life 1,000,000 years ago. "Old Grove. Seek the heart at the old grove." Then it disappeared into the mist, a phantom that moved amidst the vapor, and I was left standing there with my fly down, thinking about my next move. Dad was overjoyed when I asked if Camber and Son was hiring the next morning. "Would you really want to work in the forest with your old man?" he said hopefully. "You don't think the chainsaw and the fallen trees would mess with your, whatever it is you got going on?" "Nah, Dad, I don't think it will. Besides, I need some income if I'm gonna get my own place. Can't live in Mommy and Daddy's house forever." I hadn't told them about the housing bonus the Army sent me every month. The money was not my objective, nor the reason I wanted to go into the woods. Camber and Son cut the woods back from the town itself, but they also went the deepest, and sometimes went as far as the borders to the old grove, the spot where the foresters were said to make their home. Camber and Sons were my best chance of finding out what had taken Simon. They were my best chance of seeing my brother again, in whatever form he might have taken now. I'm sitting at my computer, soaking wet in the clothes I've been wearing all evening. I want to get this all down while I can still remember it perfectly. I say that like I'll ever be able to forget it. I was raised Baptist. I've lived in the Deep South for most of my life, and it was normal to be religious, even zealously so. I went to the usual activities: Bible vacation school, church camp, church 3 nights a week, sermons on Sundays, and until I went to college, I was pretty much a regular churchgoer. Once I left for college, kind of getting out of that environment, I kind of fell off, though. Suddenly, passing classes was a little more important than keeping up with my spiritual health. Suddenly parties and dating were more important than my relationship with God. So I blinked one day and realized it had been almost 15 years since I'd been to church, and I thought I might like to experience it again. A quick Google search showed me a church in my area that wasn't too far out of town and seemed like it'd be a good fit for me. I saw from their community Facebook page that they were having an event on Saturday. Just a meet and greet for new members, bring a covered dish for the potluck, with a spiritual event to follow where new members could get baptized and join the church. I didn't have anything going on Saturday, so I thought that sounded pretty good. I made a macaroni casserole, one of the few things I actually knew how to make, and on Saturday, I sat at about 3 p.m. in my best church clothes. As I pulled up outside the church, I was worried that I might be a little underdressed in my button-up and work slacks. People were going in, men in suits, crisp white shirts, ladies in long dresses, and kids in the sort of Sunday school clothes I was used to seeing at different churches. Made me think there might be a dress code. I was new, though, and I figured that if I wasn't within that dress code, they'd let me know. So I took my dish and headed for the fellowship hall that was set off beside the church. I walked in the side door to a very familiar scene. The welcome was immediate and warm. A woman came to take my dish to the table as the pastor came to introduce himself as Pastor Marshall. I had expected a firm handshake and, to be left alone to mingle, but the pastor took me to each of the little groups there and introduced me to his congregation. I met his deacons, their families, the aldermen and their wives, the treasurer, the underpastors, and about 24 other families. I was escorted to the food table by some of the deacons and told which dishes were the best and which ones were best avoided. Miss Liz is a good woman, but there's quite a few eggshells in her dressing. And which had been made by eligible ladies of the church. Miss Conroy's daughter's about your age and makes a great pecan pie. I was spirited away to a table where I was bombarded with questions and anecdotes and given the usual church gossip. It was honestly a little like being home again. The church I'd belonged to in my childhood was very tight-knit, and as the kids ran around and the adults talked and laughed quietly, I felt a sense of homecoming wash over me. As the food was eaten and the plates were thrown away, we all moved into the worship hall for service. I sat on the front row with the 4 or 5 other new faces, and as Pastor Marshall mounted the pulpit, I couldn't help but smile. I felt a warmth in me, and I was already thinking about how I would have to change my schedule so I could come on Sundays and Wednesdays. As he laid out a sermon on acceptance and forgiveness, I began to reflect on my life here. It's hard not to when you've found somewhere you intend to stay for a while. In my mind, I would find fulfillment in the church, just like I had as a kid. I'd meet a nice girl, raise a family, grow old within the community, where they would support me and my little ones. I know it sounds a little silly, but we all know the places that our mind goes during times like this. I see we have some new faces on the front bench tonight. Would any of you like to join our church and get baptized tonight? I stood up like a coal had been lit under me. I felt moved in a way that I never had to go to the altar, to renew my vows to God, and be washed clean in the baptismal font. The pastor smiled as he waved me up, and I had to stop myself from sprinting up the stairs. I was excited. I was in such a hurry to be part of this. I had no idea what I was in for. The pastor had me recite the affirmation, the renewal of my promise to God, and when he turned to indicate the space behind the pulpit, I realized they had an indoor baptismal pool. I'd never seen one of those before. We always did our baptisms in a nearby creek, but as he took my hand and led me towards it, I realized he meant to baptize me fully clothed. I fished the things out of my pocket that I didn't want to get wet, my phone, my keys, my wallet, etc., and set them on the stairs before stepping into the slightly warm water. I wouldn't normally have agreed to let my clothes get wet. I don't like being in wet clothes as a rule, but I was operating in a daze, and when he knelt to dip me, I felt my knees bending as I went down as well. I baptize you in the name of the Father, His Son, and the Holy Spirit. Good luck. I opened my mouth to ask why I would need luck, but as he dipped me back, my mouth was filled with water, and I was enveloped in the warm embrace of the pool. It didn't have the acrid smell of chlorine like I had thought it would. It was salty, actually, and that took me by surprise. I lay on my back beneath the water, waiting to be pulled back up, and when I opened my eyes, I realized that the hand was gone, and I was alone in the depths of the pool. The pool was suddenly deeper than I remembered it. The surface glimmered miles above me. The bottom was a shadowy depth beneath me, and I was floating in the depths like a diver. I started to panic, thinking I would drown, but the longer I sat beneath, the less I was worried. I was floating in the placid space, hovering in the placental moment, and I felt utterly at peace with the world and everything within it. I didn't notice that something was getting closer to me until it was almost too late. It began as a chill in the water, something that chased away the warmth of that pool. I opened an eye, looking to the far side, and saw a shadow rising from the distance. It was small at first, a black cloud that grew as it floated closer, but it grew wider as it came towards me. It was, I don't know. It was like something you see from the depths when you're still in the part of the water where the light can reach you. It was something I was afraid would take hold of me and drag me into the murk where I would be lost. Whatever it was, it filled me with a dread that I had never known before. As it continued to draw closer, I thought it might be a whale. I had thought at first that it might be a bank of darkness, but as it grew closer, I could see that the blackness was just how it looked. It seemed to exist inside its own fog of murk, and what I could see wasn't terribly pleasant. Its skin was gray, pebbly like a stony shore, and it appeared scaled or maybe ridged. Its eyes were huge, and the closer it got, the smaller I felt. It was massive, beyond the description of size or dimensions, and the closer it got, the less I wanted to be the focus of that attention. This must be what an ant felt like as it stood on a finger of a human, what an insect felt like before the frog devours it, and I could feel my whole body vibrating under the strain of its continued existence. It seemed to lean closer as it came up before me, our bodies inches from each other, and when it spoke, I could feel it in my bones. "Welcome back, my child." It reached out a massive finger, the print on the end looking like the indicators on a map. Even the end of that finger was bigger than my whole body, and it was like someone reaching out with a building to touch me. I closed my eyes, feeling it would obliterate me with that massive digit. But when it came into contact with my forehead, I was enveloped in a blinding light that burned me to a cinder. I came up gasping and thrashing from the depths, the pastor catching me as the congregation cheered. As their applause rose to envelop me, I looked down at the pool, expecting to see myself floating or standing on the edge of a lip, but the whole baptismal font was only about 2 feet deep. Standing up, I could see the water wasn't even over my knees. The pastor looked up, still bent and kneeling at the bottom of the pool, and his expression was resplendent. Did he know what would happen? Did anything happen while I was floating in that abyss? The longer I stared at him, the longer I came to believe that he had known what would happen, and his eyes seemed to be trying to calm me as he stood and embraced me as a brother. As he did, I heard him whisper into my ear to be easy. "Steady on, son, steady on. It's a little jarring at first, but it's all over now. Rejoice in the light, and be well." When I looked at him again, I could see a deeper understanding in his eyes, Something I didn't know how I had missed before. When I looked out across the congregation, it was a look I saw mirrored in them as well. I was speechless, unsure of what to do, and when he led me out of the pool, it was all I could do not to break into a run. He offered me a towel, letting me stand shivering beside the pool as he asked the others if they wanted to come up. When the second man approached, seeming more hesitant than I had been, I grabbed my things and snuck out the choir entrance that led to the fellowship hall. It was empty now, the whole space covered in semi-shadow, and within that shadow, I could feel the regard of whatever had spoken to me in the depths. The next thing I knew, I was in my car and driving too fast from him. It was a miracle that I didn't get pulled over, though I briefly wondered who I had to thank for that. As I sit here now, my shaking has nothing to do with the cold. If this was the God of my father, the God I've been praying to all my life, then I think I'd rather be an atheist. Even as I sit here now, I can still imagine floating in that void as the ancient creature regards me kindly, its mind brushing against my own, and the dread threatening to overtake me again. I'd pray for oblivion, but I know what's waiting there for me now. "Hey, Sarge, can I see you for a minute?" I'd taken half a step towards the cell when Officer Marshall stuck a meaty paw out to stop me. "Don't engage him. It's best to just ignore that one." I nodded, feeling a little bad for just blowing the guy off as we got back to counting inmates. It was my first day in confinement, and I wanted to make a good impression on the guys I'd be spending a lot of time with in the near future. Corrections was not a job I'd ever seen myself doing, but after college, I didn't have as many prospects as I'd thought I would. I could go work at the diner, I could go work at the hardware store, I could go work as a laborer at one of the local farms, or I could pick up and move somewhere with better job prospects. I wasn't really opposed to leaving Cashmere. It was a small town without a lot going for it, but I wasn't in a place where I could afford to leave at the moment. I started looking for jobs in other cities, and that's when I stumbled across a posting for Stragview. After looking at the pay range, I started making a plan. With the sign-on bonus and pay grade, I could work here for the next 2 to 3 years and have enough money saved up to move myself across the state, set myself up in a job that actually interested me. What's more, the security certification I got from training would look good in my portfolio and maybe open up my prospects with employers. So I signed up, took the 90-day training certification, and started my 2-year tour at Stragview Penitentiary. After a few shifts of coming into work on time and not being a totally worthless human being, my captain asked if I wanted to try my hand at confinement. He said he had a lot of brutes and manhandlers, but not a lot of people willing to have a conversation with an inmate. Maybe talk them out of some dumb stuff. His last one had apparently gone home and murdered his whole family before winding up here for execution, and he mostly had brutes back there after that. You and Marshall can good cop, bad cop these guys a little, and maybe I won't have to fill out so much use of force paperwork on some dumbass from G-Dorm. I'd agreed, and here I was, in the show, as they called it. We finished counting the 3 quads, and when we got back to the station, the grizzled old sergeant went for a smoke. "Keep an eye on 2, he mumbled, patting Marshall on the arm as he left. I'd taken a seat in one of the ancient old chairs they kept there, Marshall sitting behind the bank of cameras that made up our new surveillance post, before he turned to look at me. He steepled his fingers, trying to choose his words very carefully, and I immediately got a little nervous. I had been told that Marshall was a little ornery, a little hard to get along with, but he seemed fine to me. The 2 of us had talked about strategy games and fantasy novels. Marshall was a big Salvatore fan, as big as I was, and when we'd called count, he'd gone out to the floor like we'd done it 1,000 times before. "I'm only going to say this once, but I want you to listen. I'm not trying to tell you your business. I'm not trying to scare you, but I don't want you to get hurt. The inmate in G101 is best avoided at all costs." I nodded, but internally I breathed a sigh of relief. He was just talking about the guy I'd started to talk to. Guy was probably a lifer or someone who liked to mess with the new guys. I'd seen a story in training about downing the duck, and I figured it was in the same vein as that. Once he talked to you, you were probably hooked, and eventually he'd reel you in. That's inmate, I tried to remember his name, but Marshall beat me to it. James Tiberius Bobicus. He spoke the name like an incantation against evil. He's been a resident of G1 for the last year and a half, and for the last year and 2 months, I've tried to get him sent elsewhere. The man's a menace, a manipulator. He will waste your time at any given opportunity. It's best to just leave him be. Don't speak to him. Don't acknowledge him. What about showers, I asked, not sure that we could ignore him and still give him the things he was supposed to have. He doesn't get them. We open his flap, and only if he moves to the back of the cell. A towel and a bar of soap go in. He bird baths, or he smells. He has only himself to smell good for, anyway. Is he housed alone, I asked, still curious about this strange inmate that had Marshall so spooked. He is, he confirmed, but that's what happens when you're responsible for the deaths of 2 cellmates and an officer. He killed an officer? I asked, startled since the man I'd seen looking through the glass hadn't looked like much. Not here, surely, or he'd be somewhere else. Marshall shook his head, glancing at the cameras before looking out into the shadowy depths of Quad 2 for a second. He killed 3 men in that cell. One of them when he first got here, another 5 months later, and an officer 5 months after that. That's why I'm telling you this. I want you prepared for this man when he comes to talk to you. He is never to be by the door when you open that flap. He is always to be at the back of the cell, facing away from the door, or he gets nothing. He doesn't eat, he doesn't get fresh clothes, he doesn't get anything unless he's facing away from you. Once the things he is required to have go into his cell, you close the flap and walk away. Got it? He smiled as he finished, and I believed him when he said that he wasn't joking or this wasn't some kind of weird hazing. I told him I had it, and as Sergeant walked back in, smelling of cigarettes, we went to start showers for the evening. That began my time around inmate Bobicus. He was a weird guy, kind of small and quiet for the most part. His parentage was difficult to pin down. He looked mixed race, but which races had mixed was anybody's guess. Marshall just shrugged when I asked him. About once a shift, he would try to get my attention, but it was only when Marshall wasn't around. Marshall was a big guy, probably in his early to mid-40s, who had hands and arms like a longshoreman. Sometimes he would glower at Bobicus, and the inmate would smile and give him this ain't-we-old-pals look. He never spoke to him, and the inmate's food always came in a brown bag so we could drop it in and close it up before the inmate could leave the back of the cell. True to his word, Bobicus never showered, never saw a medical, never received meds, never got so much as a letter from anyone. Not because we withheld these things from him, but because no one wanted to have anything to do with him. He was utterly forgotten, a black spot in the dorm, and no one seemed to want to speak with him, inmates or staff. I felt a little bad for him in the beginning, but after night of dealing with him, I became less sympathetic. You see, inmate Bobicus wanted nothing so much as your attention, and he wasn't picky about how he got it. Every round he would try some gamble to get you to acknowledge him. He would try charm. Hey, Sarge, I bet you got something tasty in your lunch bag. If you don't, you can have a soup of mine or something. I got a few out. He tried to interest you in things you might have in common. Hey, Sarge, you catch a game last night? Who won? I remember the Ravens were really getting their asses kicked in the... He would try insults. Yeah, move along, pussy. I don't want to talk to you no ways. I can tell you a weak shit by the... He would claim medical assistance. Officer, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I need a nurse. I need to go to the hospital. Help me. Somebody help me. Sometimes he would try to move you by beginning to wail and beg for help. Sarge, I need someone to talk to for a minute. I'm thinking dark thoughts. I'm feeling so low. I just need someone to talk to for... But no matter what, we would ignore him and keep doing what we were doing. He never pursued any of this, he never hurt himself, and if you called medical for his emergencies, they would say that he was fine and refused to come down. Everyone you talked to about inmate Babicus seemed to have the same opinion of him, and it was a universal thing that no one liked him or would interact with him. He was an enigma, but he was a mystery I was usually too busy to worry about. Until they started taking Marshall out of confinement, that was. It happened at briefing about 6 months after I started there. We were getting ready to head to our dorms when we were informed that Marshall was going to work as Security 9 that night. Security 9 is the front man for the captain, the power behind the throne, and is usually the one who settles issues in the dorm so the captain doesn't have to. They gave me and Sarge some new guy, Perkins, and I was told to train him up and get him ready for the show. Marshall said it would probably just be temporary, and I went to go train Perkins so he'd be a useful replacement. 4 months later, Perkins had become 40, had become vets, had finally become an officer we'd received from another facility named Adams. At this time, Sarge had been replaced by a useless Sarge named Belford. We'd come in one evening to hear that Sergeant Thomas, had been hospitalized after a bad heart attack. They weren't sure he was going to come back, despite his insistence that he needed to return to his post, and Belford had been elected to replace him as our confinement sergeant. Belford greeted Adams and I, shaking our hands and telling us it was a pleasure to work with us, but he turned out to be useless. Marshall had told me ahead of time, strictly off to the side, that he would be a poor replacement for Sarge, but I didn't believe him right away. Marshall was a good guy. We'd become very good friends over the past few months, but he could be a bit of a pessimist. He's lazy, unmotivated, and he will not do paperwork or rounds. Worse, when he tries to do paperwork, he messes it up worse than if he just didn't do it at all. Adams is lazy too, but at least he can be counted on to finish showers and help with chow. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, buddy, but you're basically the confinement sergeant now. You will hate it. You will likely dream of quitting, but stick it out. In the end, I think your efforts may be rewarded. That began the worst 3 months of my life. Bedford was every bit as bad as Marshall had warned. Very few of the COs on my shift were the picture of health, but Bedford made the others look good by comparison. He would not do rounds. He would not deal with inmates unless forced, and when he did, he would simply give them whatever they wanted so he could return to his bubble. What he did do was book inmates into confinement, ruin perfectly good paperwork, and watch YouTube all night, as he elevated the stock price of Hot Pockets, 1 box at a time. After a month, I told him to stop doing folders, and I would do them when I got done with showers. He was happy to oblige, and every night after that, he happily sprayed crumbs across the keyboard as he consumed carbs and cat videos in equal parts. I sighed in disgust, my pants and shirt sweaty from moving grown men between showers and cells for the first 4 hours of my shift, as I turned back to the folders that were the lifeblood of the unit. Sometimes I would manage to kick the chair Adams was sleeping in hard enough to wake him up for a round. Sometimes I'd just do it myself. But ultimately, the work got done, and I persevered. It was month 13 for me of my 24-month plan, a plan I suspected would stretch on for another year because I had given up on rejoining normal society. That was when the mystery of inmate Babicus was finally solved. It was a mystery that would be solved with pain and tears in the end. Through all of this, inmate Babicus had not changed at all. He continued to harass every guard who walked past him, but all of them knew better than to interact with him. I had warned all the new ones, but Adams seemed to have nothing for him from the start. He would spit and cuss and kick all he wanted, but he was ignored, and he continued to fester in the cell like a mushroom in the shower stall. He still tried, though on the day in question, he finally got a reaction out of me. It had been the day from hell. 2 inmates had flooded their cells, making showers take way longer than they should have. Day shift hadn't finished the medical visits, so a nurse showed up at 10 to get us to pull some inmates for night meds. The night shift that had been here the night before, D shift, had messed up the folders by entrusting them to a new bubble officer, so I spent most of the night fixing them. I had to do incident reports for the 2 inmates who flooded, since we had to use force on them to get them to stop, and when round time came at 4, I still wasn't halfway through the folders. I looked over to Adams, but realized he was already gone. A glance through the window showed me he was out on the floor with the nurse doing morning med pass, and they were still in quad 4, which meant they had just started. I looked at Bedford, the big lummox pounding the desk as a cat did something stupid while a person voiced it over, and shook my head as I went to do a round. I started in 1, and that was when it happened. You see, on top of all that, inmate Babacus had tried to bother me every time I went past his cell that night. He had exhausted all gambits and taken to insulting me more than anything. I was a pussy. I was a cracker. I was a homophobic slur that I won't use here. I performed sex acts with various members of my own species and other species, and on and on and on and on. I had ground my teeth every time I heard his voice, until I was pretty sure that my left bottom molar was about to crack. But I'd be lying if I said that was all it was. Babacus had been repeating this process every night for as long as I could remember, and by now it was like a constant ice floe eroding a stone. My patience, my mental health, my will to live, it was all in tatters, and I was worried that someday I might hurt him more than I was worried about him hurting me. It's hard to explain, but after a while the darkness starts creeping up on you, and all the hopelessness and negativity turns you into the very thing you hate. No matter how much you fight it, eventually it gets its claws in you, and that night, it got me. I was coming around his cell when a small voice snapped the minor threads of my sanity like piano wire. "Sarge, can I talk to you for a minute?" When his voice hit me, I lost it. "What, Babacus?" I shouted, turning my full attention to the cell door for the first time. "What the hell do you want?" It was dark, but I could see his eyes as he peeked at me through the thin sheet of plexiglass. When he smiled, his teeth looked very white in the dark space, but I was too lost to rage to care. He had wanted my attention. Well, now he had it. "I just wanted to know what your plans were for after work." I opened my mouth to tell him it was none of his damn business what I meant to do. But instead, I told him the truth. And as the anger drained out of me in slow spurts, I felt a sense of intense malaise wash over me. I'm gonna sleep until it's time to come back to work again. I might stop for some food, too. "That's good. Man, when I was on the outside, I used to love to make weird stuff with gas station food. I'd go buy ramen noodles and canned cheese and He just kept talking, kept laying out his recipe for something that sounded terrible, but I couldn't turn away. I found myself getting closer to the door, stepping right up next to stare at the grate as I listened, and as he went on, I could smell his rancid breath through the little holes. I tried to pull against it. I didn't want to waste my time with him, but the longer I listened, the more I was drawn in. "You got any coffee up there, Sarge? I bet you drink it with cream and sugar. My mom and I used to sit on the back porch and drink coffee and watch the sun come up. She was the only person who ever actually talked with me. Everyone else just ignores me or they die, but Mom always seemed to enjoy hearing me talk. I guess she died too, but not 'cause of nothing I did. She was just old, and one day she says, 'James, I won't be around forever, so you better—'" My teeth chattered a little, my legs shaking as I stood listening to his story. What was happening to me? I felt pulled towards the grate, his words drawing me in, and the longer I listened, the weaker I felt. Someone was saying something over the radio, but anything not coming out of this man's mouth was tuned down to background noise. I felt like I might be getting sleepy, like I might be getting ready to pass out. But Babacus was only getting started. The longer he talked, the more sturdy his voice became. The more I listened, the less weak he sounded, the more he sounded like he was growing. How tall was the man? He hadn't appeared very large, but the more he spoke, the more it seemed like his voice was rising up the door frame. When she died, I just didn't know what to do with myself, Sarge. I was so sad, I had started making my own way. I was like a child by myself, and all I knew was talking. I started talking to people, telling my story, and then they just kept dying. At first it was weird, just watching them shrivel up the longer they listened, but pretty soon I figured out it was me doing it. I was taking something from them, something I had never been able to take before. You see, when I was a kid, I was real shy. I only really talked to my mom and clammed up otherwise. I remember once a teacher tried to get me to talk in front of the class, but the words fell from his mouth like diarrhea, and the phrase had never been more apt to me. He was rambling, spewing his words like a fire hose, and the longer I listened, the weaker I felt. This was how he killed people, I thought, as his rambling went on and on. He talked them to death and stole their life. Pretty soon, he'll do the same to me, I thought, and I tried to break away so that I could get out of the vacuum. I pushed with all my might, trying to snap out of my trance, but I was in too deep. I could hear someone yelling, hear inmates kicking and screaming, but I was powerless to do anything but sit there and listen to this fool babble. When someone hit me in a football tackle, I gasped in pain as my hip impacted the stairs. I broke my hip in 3 places, and it likely saved my life. Marshall had hit me around the waist, and when he stood up, he started shouting at the quad for all of them to shut up. He very carefully avoided speaking to Babacus, but I could see him give Marshall the same knowing grin that he had fixed on him before. Marshall called medical down, and I was loaded onto an ambulance and taken to Cashmere Medical Center. It's all kind of a blur after the EMTs gave me a shot of something, but when I came back to myself, I was in a crisp, clean hospital room, with Marshall sitting across from me in an oversized chair, the ones they always leave for guests. "Good. I was afraid I was too late," he said, breathing a sigh of relief. "Too late?" I asked, and I almost flinched at how brittle my voice sounded. "Belford called to tell me that you needed assistance in G. Stat, but the stupid fool didn't bother to give any details. The story is that you tripped going down the stairs and hurt yourself. The camera footage will likely go missing, and the prison will pay for your medical bills and put you on workman's comp." I nodded, wincing as my hip throbbed painfully. "Marshall, what the hell happened out there?" "What happened is you engaged inmate Babacus in conversation and discovered why no one else will. It's hard to understand if you've never seen it in action, but now you know better." Marshall flexed his fingers for a moment, trying to find the words to convey what I was really asking, and finally decided to just push ahead. "About a year before you started, I made the same mistake. I knew better. I'd been told better, but Babacus is crafty. He picks and picks and picks until you just can't take it anymore. That night he finally got under my skin. I had an inmate in the quad kicking his door and threatening to hurt himself, and the captain we had made Belford look like a super cop. He refused to come down and deal with it, telling us to handle it, and Babacus happened to be his neighbor. I'd answered him honestly, thinking it was the guy in the cell that I'd been dealing with, and before I knew it, he had me. I stood there and listened to his nonsense, feeling my energy get sapped away as he talked. He had me for about 3 minutes before Sarge noticed what was happening. My fellow floor officer was at the captain's office. He was useless and was out flirting with the girl who did all the paperwork for our useless captain, and Sarge popped the emergency keys and ran to save me. He dragged me off the floor and pulled me back to the station, but the damage was done. Marshall looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw pain behind his eyes as he asked his next question. "How old do you think I am?" I shook my head. "I don't know. 40? 43 tops." He smiled, but there was no joy behind it. "I'll be 25 this year. I'm only 3 years younger than you. This is what Babacus does to you. He sucks the life out of you to feed his own sick needs, but not anymore. The warden says he's going somewhere special, somewhere he can't ever do this again. We can rest easy, knowing you'll be the last. At least I hope so." He left after that, saying he had to get some sleep before work tonight. I look at myself now and understand what Marshall meant. I've aged 10 years in a matter of minutes, and I wonder if the change is purely to my appearance. Did he take those years from me? How did he manage to do this with only words? Did the warden know that this was something he was capable of? It seems as if he must have, but then why would he give him the opportunity to do it again? The longer I sit here contemplating it, the more I question what other monsters might lay within Stragview, and whether I want to go back there and face them a second time. I know it's been a little bit, or maybe it hasn't, but I hope you guys haven't worried about me too much. It's been a really productive few days. I met someone, and he really helped me figure this thing out. He also helped me learn a few things that I wasn't aware of. Some things that scare the hell out of me. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened since I last posted. I spent several days in GG, the store with the Mother's Day decorations, just getting my head together. You may have a hard time believing this, but I don't often have to attack people in my day-to-day life. Every now and again, you may have to bump chests with a rowdy customer at the sub shop, but I hadn't actually had to fight another human being since high school. The thought that I might have killed the guy was repugnant to me. I was afraid to move on to the next shop as well. What if I found another person like that? What if I found a whole tribe of them? The person who had slept below the shelves and prayed they would crush him seemed like worlds away from me, and I found that maybe I did want to keep living. After a few days of eating and feeling sorry for myself, I collected up the things that would come with me and stepped through the bathroom door again. I went back to my usual routine, but finding another person made me think. Was I the only one leaving marks? Was I the only one marking the stores in case I needed to find my way back? I looked around, but I never found anything beyond the usual graffiti or vandalism. Rude words scrawled on the door by the bathroom, sometimes in English and sometimes not. I also found hearts with initials, catchphrases, the usual things that children do. It meant nothing until I saw something different in store KK. I'd been traveling slower, really looking for signs of other people, and that's when I found the bulletin board. I knew something was different when I walked into KK. The shelves weren't full like the others had been. They weren't empty, not really, but they were sparse, and they looked picked over. Things were out of place, too. The store had furniture, and some of it had been arranged in a way that made me think people had been sleeping close for comfort. The ceiling tiles were hanging down, too, something I didn't like, and the music was nothing but harsh static. Also, there was a sign written on poster board in the front window. I blinked at it when I noticed, thinking it might be mine. Someone had scrawled a similar message on the other side, but the side that would only be seen by the people in the store was different. The writing was messy, scribbled with magic marker, but it was readable, and it filled me with hope that the crazy hermit might not be the norm. If you can read this, check the bulletin board in the break room. When I come back, I'll answer your message. It was like a bomb going off in my head, and I kicked myself for not looking before. How many break rooms had I been in? How many times had I used the microwave or opened the fridge to see what was inside? I had passed by the corkboard 1,000 times, but never once had I thought to read it. It would be things I had no interest in, things for employees, but it seemed now that that might not be the case. I hurried behind the counter and went to check the board, finding a treasure trove of knowledge. Their name was Gale, and they'd pinned a good many things there. Rules for the DG. 1. Don't go outside. There's nothing out there. 2. The food runs out, so don't hog it all. 3. The food doesn't go bad, so don't worry about that. 4. Whatever you do stays here. 5. Don't go into the ceiling. No one comes back from the ceiling. 6. Don't be afraid to leave. There's nothing for you here once it's gone. Another piece of paper had a picture of a dark creature that had been colored in with a crayon. The miasma, it was called. Don't let it see you or you'll die. Don't go into the ceiling or it'll get you. The last bit seemed to be a goodbye letter, and it was in the same handwriting as the others. I feel bad that I couldn't bury you properly, so let this serve as your memorial. Here lies Kenneth, Margot, Rudy, and Celine. They were the best crew anyone could have asked for, and I miss them every day. Kenneth, who was never late for work and always so full of adventure, lost when he went outside. Margot, so full of life and hope, lost to the thing that lives in the ceiling. Rudy, my son, who wanted more than his old man could give him, lost in the ceiling when he went to go get Margot. Celine, who always made sure we ate before she would, went through the door when I was too cowardly and hard-headed. Let this stand as their gravestone. Let this tell their tale. I hope to find Celine when I go through the door. I'm still scared. I'm still hard-headed. But the food won't last forever, and I have to do something. If Rudy is out there somewhere, then I'd rather die trying to find him than starve to death in this place. To whoever reads this, don't be afraid to go through the door, and I hope to see you on the other side. Gail Thornton, Assistant Manager of the Dollar General Beyond Store, 4891. I didn't know whether I should leave anything or not. This looked like a memorial more than a notice board, but if Gail came back here, I wanted him to know that someone else was out there. Paper was pretty easy to come by, ditto pens, and I scribbled a hasty introduction before pressing it to the surface with a pushpin. It looked lame beside Gail's words, but it was the best I had. I ate a little of what was left and left my mark before moving on. When I traveled now, besides leaving marks, I always checked the bulletin boards. Sometimes there were messages from Gail, but mostly there weren't. Sometimes there were other messages, though. Usually it was people looking for people, or looking for people who were lost. Some of the bulletin boards looked like the messy walls of rest stops, and two that I saw a lot were someone looking for a boy named Jacob, and someone looking for a dog named Buddy. Looking for my grandson, Jacob, 5 years old, blue shirt, blue jean shorts, Skechers light-up shoes. If you see him, keep him safe. He liked mac and cheese. Disappeared when he went to the bathroom on accident. Border collie named Buddy, black and white with some brown, blue bandana around neck. Very sweet, good service dog. Would love to see him again. The former made my blood run cold, and the more I tried to put it out of my mind, the more it stuck. Jacob, the name the old man had screamed as he lay bleeding. Was he Jacob? Was he the one looking for Jacob? I didn't know, but it didn't matter either. I couldn't get back to him, and I had no clue where his grandson was regardless. I would leave notes of my own, letting them know that I was leaving the letters if they came across them, and telling them a little about the places I could remember. It was a lot like having a pen pal, except you were never sure whether they were getting your letters, and you had no way to get letters back from them. In that respect, I guess it was more like sending messages in a bottle. It went on like that for a while, but when I came to BBB, I found out that someone had seen one of my messages and left a response. Dear Alphabet Man, very clever. I like your ingenuity. I'm glad you found the bulletin boards and have figured out a little bit about this place. Hopefully we can find each other someday. It would be nice to see a friendly face. Gail. I was thrilled. Finally someone was responding back to me. I had felt a little guilty about not trying to communicate with the old man, but this made me feel a little bit better. If we could get together, we could share knowledge. If we could meet, then maybe we could figure this out. I kept going, each new store hoping to find Gail, but each new store seemed to find me a couple of steps behind him. He was leaving messages, leaving answers to old messages sometimes too, but I never seemed to catch him. Gale and I were moving through this space differently, it seemed, and Gale was better at it than I was. Gale, I came to believe, could move backwards as well as forwards. 2 Alphabet Man. Saw your mark, the one labeled K. Be careful if you find yourself there again. Sometimes there are shadows there that like people a little too much. Gale. 2 Alphabet Man. I thought I had gone to the hermit store for a minute, but I see this may be where you began your journey. Try not to destroy any more of them. They aren't as infinite as you might believe. Gale. To the Alphabet Man. I found your stovetop in a place called SS. Hope the eggs were good, and thanks for leaving me some. Gale. This went on for 3 or 4 more trips before I found the message I was looking for. JJJ, the spot I had found myself in, looked very different from the other stores I'd been to. It looked picked clean, every shelf emptied and bare. Someone had collected a pile of things from the store and attempted to burn the door. It smelled like they'd used lighter fluid to start, and the ceiling tiles by the door had fallen as they charred and left a wide, gaping maw above. The door, however, was none the worse for wear. I skirted the edge of the ceiling hole and made my way towards the break room. I didn't expect to find anything, but I was surprised to find the break room still intact. On the board was a message written on the back of a charred newspaper. Alphabet Man, I hate to leave you in a place like this, but if you keep your current path, you should be here in a couple of days. Stay here for 2 sleeps. There's food in the back as well as water, and if I haven't made it here by then, it means something has happened and you should move on. With any luck, we'll meet up in 2 days' time. Looking forward to seeing you. Gale. I read the message a few times, not sure if I wanted to stay here or not. This place was creepy, to be sure, but the chance to meet Gale was something that I couldn't pass up. I checked on the food he had mentioned and found several days' worth of water and non-perishable items that someone had stuck in the back. There was no sign of whoever had set the fire, and I hoped that I had the place to myself. I dragged some bedding and food to the break room, feeling that I'd rather hide in there than in the open, and settled in for the next couple of days. I kept the door to the break room closed, and if anyone moved out there, I didn't hear it the first night. I mostly rested the next day, glad for the opportunity to do so. I had been going straight for a long time, resting when I was ready to fall down, and it was nice to get a little downtime. I wished it was somewhere a little nicer, but even this place told me things I didn't know. The doors, it seemed, were very resilient, but that made me wonder about Gale's story. He said that Kenneth had gone out of those doors, and I wondered how such a thing was possible. The doors seemed unmovable, and the longer I thought about it, the more I couldn't wait to hear his story when he got here. As I settled in for the second night, though, I heard something groan from the main floor and huddled deeper under my blankets. It was the exact same sound I had heard as I lay under the shelves, and as I listened to it move through the bones of the store, I realized I'd trapped myself in my pursuit for safety. If it came in here after me, I'd have no way to escape, but if I could make it to the bathroom, I could escape and touch base with Gale some other time. He would understand, especially if this was the miasma, and I pushed the blankets away as I crept towards the door. I could hear it moving on the other side of the store, and as I opened the door, I prayed it wouldn't squeak. If it made a noise, it was unnoticed by the creature, and I prepared to make a break for it. I looked around the door frame, and I felt my ambition drain away as I caught sight of the creature, and I knew terror. It was huge, its shadowy form stooped over, and it looked like nothing I had ever seen. It was darkness, a living fog bank of midnight, and as my teeth threatened to clack, I glanced at the bathroom and tried to steel myself for a run. That's when I saw something that pushed my apprehension away and filled me with renewed drive. Over by the bathroom, peeking around the side of the alcove, was a person in a red vest with a salt and pepper crew cut. He saw me too, and as he nodded his head, telling me to come here, he tossed something towards the back of the store. The bottle burst with a loud pop, and the creature growled like a mudslide. It lunged towards the back, slamming into the back wall, and I took my chance and ran. It heard me then, turning its ponderous form as it tried to give chase, but I was out of reach. Gale grabbed my wrist as we lunged through the bathroom door, and the thing was mere inches behind us. As we lay outside the bathroom, the new Dollar General a pleasant sight after the burnt-out husk we'd come from, the man smiled and offered me a hand. "It's nice to meet you properly, Alphabet Man. I'm Gale, but I suspect you already figured that out." I've been taking care of my grandma lately. She's been doing pretty bad, and she needs someone to help her almost 24/7. She's got kind of a bone disease or something. It's basically turning her bones into Swiss cheese. And I've had to carry her to the bathroom and room to room for the past couple of weeks. This might seem kind of tiresome to some people, but I'm glad to do it. My grandma and I have always been close. She basically raised me since my mother was never at home. If I can give back to her now, I consider it fair. She's been alone since I was in high school, and those 10 years have been the happiest I've ever seen her. She and Grandpa had been married for decades, 50 years before Grandpa just left, but they never seemed to get along. When I was young, Grandma would always come over and stay the night instead of having me come over there. Grandpa never came to our house. He mostly stayed close to home or went to work, but the few times I interacted with him, he seemed kind of off. Even as a kid, I didn't think he looked right. That might sound a little mean, but over time, he got paler and less coherent. He would mumble to himself with odd whispery things while he was watching TV. Grandma usually kept him in the bedroom with the TV on and the lights off. He disappeared suddenly when I was in the 9th grade, and it had been almost as much of a relief to me as for Grandma. So last week, when I slid her into bed and told her I was going grocery shopping the next day, so, she better get some sleep, she shook her head and looked away. "I doubt I will. I think this might be my last night in this bed." "Why, you eye in my bed? I'll swap you, but yours is a lot more comfortable than the one I'm in." "No, son," she cut me off, her voice thready and weak. "I think tonight might be the night I pass on." My eyes got a little big. "Do I need to call Miss Sam? If you think you're going to pass, then I should get the nurse out here, too." "I don't want them out here. You've been good to me, boy. I just want you here with me at the end. Besides, I need to tell you something. I need to confess my sins before I take them to heaven with me." "I mean, I can call Pastor Ferris over if you need to talk to someone about matters spiritual." "No, not Bobby Harris either. I want to confess to you. It's family business, and once I confess it to you, it'll be your burden to carry after I'm gone." I hesitated, thinking that I might not want this secret as I looked at Grandma's face. I had seen that face smile more than anything else, but the look she had now reminded me of something else I'd seen when I was young. It was something I hadn't noticed until I looked back through the lens of time, but Grandma had always seemed a little nervous whenever she stayed at our house. I caught her more than once checking the doors and windows, looking through the living room curtains as if expecting to see someone there. It always made me think that she was scared of someone. It was a look that always made me think a stranger was trying to get in so they could take me away. The truth, it seemed, was darker than that, though. I took a seat on the bed, willing to listen, as little as I wanted to. "I'm here, Grandma. If you need to tell me something, then I'll listen." She nodded, looking out the window in her bedroom like someone might be there. "Your granddad didn't disappear," she said, wetting her lips with her wrinkled tongue. "I killed him." That was a shock, and my face must have said as much. She smiled, without much mirth. "Didn't think your old grandma was capable of something like that, huh?" "No, it's just surprising. You guys lived together for decades. I'm not sure why you would choose 10 years ago to..." It wasn't the first time," she said, her voice as thin as a spider web. "I killed your grandpa for the first time in 1973. 10 years ago was just the last time I had to kill him." I was confused, and I said as much, but Grandma only nodded. "Your grandpa, your real grandpa, died in 1972, but he didn't stay dead." She laid it all out, something that took us nearly into the next day, but she never stopped looking out the window as she spoke. I realize now she was looking for Grandpa. "When the call came, I was pregnant with your mother. Your grandpa had avoided the draft by attending college and had managed to avoid it again with a waiver from the government. He was an engineer working on bridges and sewer systems in D.C., and I was looking forward to having him home for a few weeks. He had promised to come home before the baby was born, and he was excited to meet his daughter. We had wanted children for years, and when we talked, you could hear the tears on the verge of coming out whenever he talked about our future. The phone call that day, however, seemed to be the end of that dream. They said he'd been killed in a car accident, and that it had been very quick. He had been driving to a job site when someone had run a red light and slammed into the driver's side door. They said he died instantly, hadn't suffered a bit, and I suppose that should have been a mercy. They wanted to bury him in the Capitol, but I was adamant that he be buried here. I wanted his daughter to see him, to know her father, but I couldn't have known how much she would know of him. A week later, before his body was even home, I heard someone in the kitchen late one night." Grandma's voice got low, the husk making my skin crawl as she stared through the little window into the past. "I must have looked aside as I came out with the baseball bat, but he never saw me coming. It was a man in military fatigues, eating a sandwich and sitting at my table like he owned the place. He hadn't bothered to turn on any of the lights, and the closer I got, the more I saw. He'd left a duffel bag on the floor beside him, and there was a glass of milk sweating on the table beside his plate. His fingers slipped into the white bread, and the lettuce and tomato looked wet against the roast beef poking out. I didn't challenge him. I didn't think he even knew I was there. When I hit him in the side of the head, he went down like a sack of potatoes. I killed him in that one hit. Hit him just right, I guess, but when I went to see who it was, I felt like I might have a heart attack. It was your granddad. He was laid out on the floor, bleeding from the ears, his blood staining his fatigues. I looked up the pins he had been wearing years after the fact and realized he'd been a corporal in the army. His paperwork said he was back on leave for the birth of his child. He was on 2 weeks of leave before he went back to Vietnam. I was confused. My husband had never been in the army, and as I sat there trying to figure out what to do, I decided to just bury him in the backyard. My husband was dead, and calling up the police to let them know that this man had broken in so he could eat a sandwich would only muddy the waters. So I buried him in the backyard. No easy feat for a woman 7 months pregnant. 3 days later, I was sitting in the living room folding laundry, just trying to get back to normal, when I heard a key in the front door. I heard someone coming in, set the bag down on the end table, and then I heard the last voice I ever expected to hear again. "Sorry I'm late, dear. There was something in the office I had to set up for tomorrow before coming home." It was your grandpa, dressed in a crisp white button-up and pressed suit pants. His tie was blue and white, something I'd never seen before, and it looked expensive. I'd never seen any of his clothes, and I was the one that did all the laundry. He spread his arms wide, waiting for a hug, but I couldn't move. I'd killed him. I'd killed him 3 nights ago. I watched him die, and as I backed away from him, I saw his face twist in confusion. It was painful, a look that hurt my heart. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's me. It's Wendell, your loving man." I was against the door frame, hyperventilating, clutching my stomach as your mother kicked inside me. She could sense my fear, feel my uncertainty, and she was responding in kind. He took a step towards me, and I curled into a ball as I tried to protect myself from whatever he meant to do. I expected him to try to attack me, to turn into a vengeful spirit and come after me, but instead he just wrapped his arms around me and hugged me close. "What's wrong, darling? Are you okay? Talk to me." It sounded just like him, and when I wrapped my arms around him, I realized it felt just like him too. The smell of his aftershave, the rasp of his 5 o'clock shadow on my cheek, the way his hair smelled like Seltzer blue. It was all things that let me know it was him. When he hugged me to him, I gasped as I felt the lump on his inner arm where a birth defect had left a bone poking slightly out. It was him. It was your granddad, and I just leaned into him and sobbed as he helped me to my feet and took me to the bedroom. I checked the back of his head later that night when he slept, but there wasn't a mark or anything to lead me to believe that he had been the one I'd clobbered a few nights ago. I lived with that version of your grandpa for 6 months. He worked as a manager at a paper company, his degree in business instead of engineering, and he made a comfortable living for us. If I needed a reminder of the old times, however, I only had to look at the graduation photo hanging in the hallway. It was me and your grandpa in his cap and gown, and me in my best dress, smiling as his mom snapped a photo. I caught him looking at the picture sometimes, trying to rationalize it, before finally moving away to do whatever he'd been heading out to do. He was there for the birth of your mother, and I settled into a life of maternal bliss after that. Your grandfather was much the same as he'd always been, trading talk of bridges for talk of stocks and paper sales, but he was still the same man he'd always been. He loved your mother and me dearly. We never wanted for anything, but after a while, I suspected that something was off about him. It started with the sleep-talking. He would mumble ceaselessly from the time his eyes closed till the time they opened again. Your grandfather had always been a prolific snorer, ever since he was little, as his mother liked to say, but now he never seemed to breathe at all when he slept. He would mumble on and on about sewers and the war and stocks and paper and raising dogs and breeding horses and a million other things. Between your mother's nightly feedings and your grandfather's ceaseless muttering, I had become ragged. I couldn't sleep with all that yammering, and no matter where I slept, it always seemed to find me. I tolerated it until one night when I heard something familiar. I came awake to the sound of someone chewing and mumbling. "Where are they? Chew, chew, chew. I can't believe I had to make my own food. It's not enough that I chew, 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 went and fought them for her, but now I have to make my own sandwich." I had been sleeping on the couch, trying to get some sleep away from the muttering, and as I crept up the hall, listening to him mumble, and even the squeak of the door didn't rouse him from his nightmare. She couldn't even bother to wait for me, chew, 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 just because my bus was a little late. I'm a war hero, a soldier, and she can't even chew, chew. But he paused then, before gasping harshly. "Ah, my head! What the hell is that? It's Maggie! Oh God, she's killed me! She's killed me! She's bashed my head in with a bat! I'm dead on the floor! dead right by my kitchen table. My blood's going everywhere. She's killed me. She—" The pillow was over his face before I could stop myself. I was just so ragged, so mentally fried, that I knew he would tattle on me. He'd wake up and tell the police, and they'd find the body, and he'd be here alone with your mother, and who knew what would happen then? He wasn't her father, couldn't be her father, and he might hurt her or kill her, or— She looked back at me, and I could see her eyes swimming with tears. He only struggled a little, and then I had another body to bury. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes returning to the window, before continuing again. The next one was a car salesman, but he was less like your grandfather than the one before. I read something about how if you photocopy a photocopy, the quality degrades until it's almost unrecognizable. That's how this was. The next one sounded less like your grandfather than that, was paler than him, and seemed to get lost sometimes. I lived with this one for 2 years until he suddenly wandered into traffic outside our house. I told the police that this one was a cousin of my late husband, and that was why he looked so similar. The one after that bred horses, and when one of them threw him, I buried him at the edge of the range where he worked and went home expecting to find another one. I was becoming pretty good at losing husbands by then, and when the next one showed up, I hit him with a frying pan and left him in the backyard with the others. By the time your mother came home from school, there was a new one in the living room, reading the paper. Over the years, I'm ashamed to say I've experimented on how durable they are. I pushed one off the roof after asking him to fix something for me. He broke his neck, and I added him to the growing mass grave in my backyard. I poisoned one over the course of a year until he finally dropped dead one morning over his oatmeal. I pushed one off a mountain during a hike, only to return to the hotel and find a new one there waiting for us. The copies became paler and less coherent. Their voices became softer and less substantial. It got to the point that he couldn't hold a job. His mind was like a dementia patient, and I would look up sometimes and find him watching me through the window of wherever I was. Your mother had moved out of the house by then. A retirement check from somewhere showed up in the mailbox from a company that manufactured pipes. The money was good, the money kept us afloat, but I was tired of living with this pale ghost. Then, about 8 years ago, he walked out of the house one morning and never came back. In many ways, it was a blessing. I had become responsible for him. I had to take care of him and lead him around like a child. Suddenly, I was responsible for just me again. I kept cashing those checks until they stopped coming about a year ago, and I kept waiting for the day when he'd come back. I almost dreaded it because it would mean that he had died, and a new pale copy would take his place again. Grandma turned away from the window, locking eyes with me as the night slid by outside. Now it's your secret. It's your secret and your burden. The bodies in the back are still there. I checked periodically, and though they decompose, the bones remain. I don't know if this version of your grandfather will ever come back, but you will have to watch for him now. I've left everything here for you. The house, the accounts, everything. It's yours now, and I pray it brings you joy. She lay back then, and I could almost watch the life slipping out of her. By midnight, she was dead, and when I turned to get the phone, I saw what she had been waiting for. Gramps was paler than I remembered him, but he looked exactly the same otherwise. He waved at me as he stood there before backing away and leaving the way he had come. I went to the backyard and looked, but there was no one there, and no clue that anyone had been there in the first place. We buried Grandma in a plot next to Grandpa's original body. She lay peacefully there beside her husband. The caretaker tells me that someone comes to see her, though, leaving a single wildflower behind before moving on. I don't think he'll come back, but who's to say what the future might bring? In the meantime, I called the police to let them know about all the bodies in the backyard. The sheriff came and exhumed them, asking all kinds of questions that he didn't seem to believe the answers to. He had them tested, and to his surprise, all of them came back a match for my grandfather. Dental records, DNA, hair samples, it all comes back a match, and they were all left scratching their heads. They couldn't really charge my grandmother with anything. You can't put a dead person in prison after all, and they were left with a mystery for the ages. Either way, it's nice to have the bodies gone, and it was good that Grandma got to die at peace. As for Grandpa, I guess I'll just have to wait for the day when a new one shows up. Hopefully, I won't have a body of my own to bury when he does. When Carl came up to the desk, I assumed this was just another middle-of-the-night BS session. He had been stalking around the hospital most of the afternoon, looking for something, but not saying a lot. The fact that he had a couple of the other security guys with him should have tipped me off, but I was a little busy myself that afternoon. We'd had a doctor quit suddenly, and they'd asked me to fix the schedule as I moved the hospitalist schedule around to cover. It sounds pretty important, but my supervisor had done all the work, and I was just reporting the news and changing the spreadsheet around. So far, I'd been cussed at by 3 doctors, had a 4th tell me that they weren't going to show up for their assigned rounds, not my problem, and had another agree, but say that they should have been consulted first. After that, I'd had to call in Team A, the on-call surgical team, for an emergency surgery, something that had taken far longer than it should have. It's amazing how people are happy to cash their overtime checks, but they'll dog cuss you on the phone when you call them in to earn it. Of the 6, I got 5, and the 6th was another case of none of my business. I'd called and left messages, and if they got fired over it, then hey, that had nothing to do with me. It was about 1 a.m., and I was settling in for some YouTube drama with a favorite channel of mine, when Carl came slowly to the desk. The look he had was speculative, but a little worried that he might be on that list of people who are about to lose their jobs. "What's on your mind, Carl?" I asked, when he didn't come right out and say it, instead leaning on the counter like a bird on a wire. "I need to know if you saw somebody come in and leave today, at least since you've been here." My desk was near a major entrance, so my seeing someone wouldn't be outside the realm of possibilities. "Sure, who was it?" "A bald guy, light red scrubs, wearing black leather sandals. He was clean-shaven, and his eyes are the clearest blue I've ever seen." I furrowed my brow, thinking over it, but not needing to think too hard. Red scrubs were not a color assigned with any department that I was familiar with, so somebody in any color of red would have stood out. Sandals would have caught my eye too, since the hospital required all employees to wear closed-toed shoes. The man's description would have definitely stood out, and I shook my head, telling him I hadn't seen anyone like that. "Can you come by the office when you get off?" He didn't seem like he wanted me to, but he needed me to see whatever he was seeing. "Sure," I said, feeling a little weird. "What is it, Carl? Usually you're more than happy to tell me what's going on." He didn't seem to know what he just wanted. "I don't want you to go in with expectations, I guess. I want your opinion without you knowing much about it. After you tell me what you think, I'll tell you what I know. Deal?" I nodded, telling him that sounded fine. I had 5 hours to think it over, and by 6 a.m., when my relief staggered in with a yawn and a fresh Starbucks coffee, my curiosity was piqued. I I came down to the ER where Carl had his security office. The office was a cramped little room that held one person comfortably and 3 people regularly. How they had gotten those 2 desks inside without building him in there was beyond me, but they took up all the wall space that wasn't the door frame. Even then, you had to turn sideways and shimmy between the edges of the desks, and 2 or 3 more honey buns, and Carl might have to call for the jaws of life some night. The walls were a scrawl of pictures and schedules and memes and random other things, pinned to the 6 huge corkboards that took up 2 walls, the other 2 being plexiglass so the officers on duty could look out into the ER, the epicenter of trouble most nights. One of the desks had an ancient CCTV monitor on it, and that was where I found Carl. "Have a seat," he said, leaning over to open a folder with 5 different videos in it. "What's this about, Carl?" I asked. The last 5 hours had my mind wandering over 100 different scenarios, and I was curious, as curious as I had ever been. "Just watch," he told me. "If you recognize the guy, I need to know if he came in, and especially if he left." "Carl, I told you I hadn't—" I know, but I want your honest opinion here. I'm a little freaked out by this guy, and I just want to know what you think of him. I want to know if he's something spooky or not." I got it then. Carl thought the guy might be a spook or something, and he wanted me to take a look and tell him it wasn't so. He wanted me to laugh and say that, "Oh, that was old so-and-so from whatever department," and call him a goose. He wanted to be sure that this wasn't supernatural, that it was a flesh-and-blood human, and that it was something he could catch. Even if it was flesh and blood, I wasn't sure he would want to catch it. "Just take a look," Carl said, and started the video before stepping back. It was a scene from the 3rd floor, and I realized it was where the Code Blue had taken place earlier. Code Blues weren't uncommon, but this one had resulted in a death, and it stood out. It was far from the first time I had called a code on someone who died, but it always kind of sticks with you. I tried to remember which room it had been that I had called it for, and when the guy in the red scrubs came out, I realized he was leaving the exact room I was trying to remember. 312's door was closed, but as the man came out, he pulled the door shut behind him and hurried off down the hall. From the moment I saw the guy, I knew something was off. The scrubs he wore looked hand-stitched, the lines standing out on the fabric like an accusation. His head was smooth-looking, and I thought I saw a little gleam as he walked beneath the lights. His face was equally as smooth, and his facial features looked oddly flat, like stickers someone had put on a doll. The whole appearance looked unnatural, but as his eyes looked up at the camera, I found myself trapped by those orbs as they swam in his face. I hadn't wondered how Carl knew that he had blue eyes until I caught sight of them. The CCTV footage was in black and white, but the man's eyes were crystal blue on the monochrome screen. "How?" I asked, but I couldn't think of how to end it. I suppose the question was still valid, nonetheless. "I don't know," Carl said, "but I've crawled over the camera footage and I can't figure out how he came into the room. I can't seem to find out when he came into the hospital, or when he left either. Hell, he never even exits the stairwell. I've checked the camera for every floor it connects to, and the roof. The man goes into the stairwell door and just disappears." I rewound the video, watching the strange man come out again, but his exit seemed as unnatural as he was. It was clear that Carl suspected he had something to do with the Code Blue, but his gait, his appearance, everything about him was so artfully at ease. He wasn't hurrying, wasn't rushing, and seemed to think getting caught was an impossibility. "That's not all, though," Carl said, reaching over as he queued up another video. "This is from the Code Blue a couple of days ago, the death on the day shift." This one was a different angle. The bubble lens showed the 4 North hallway and the nurses at their station. It was around noon, and the food carts were still moving up and down the hall as lunch was being served. The man stepped out, his image blocked by a food cart for half a second, before he walked up the corridor and had a camera. A moment later, all the nurses were scrambling towards the room he'd walked out of, but it seemed weird that none of them had acknowledged him as he came by. Cashmere Hospital was big, but it was still a down-home hospital. Most everybody got a nod or a wave when they saw someone they knew, but no one had looked up to wave or say hey to this guy. It was almost like they hadn't even seen him. "You see," Carl said, "he came out, and then the code blue came not long after." "So, what, you think he's causing the deaths?" I asked, wondering why I was here if Carl suspected that the guy had injected them with something, or smothered them with a pillow, or something like that. "That's just it," Carl said exasperatedly. "All the deaths are completely natural. The one today was from a heart attack, and the one on 4 North was a lung infection. The tech didn't report any weird needle marks or anything, and both of the patients were dead when the nurses arrived. That's why I was sort of hoping this was spooky in nature or something. Maybe he's stealing their life force or drinking their blood or something like that?" he asked, almost hopefully. I only shrugged. "I have no clue, Carl. If he's a vampire, then that would be a first, and I've never seen a ghost hurt people in here. Hell, even Shaky Leg Mary mostly just scares people and lets them hurt themselves." Carl sat back heavily, and I could tell he was hoping for an easy explanation. Well, not an easy explanation, I guess, but we had all gotten a little used to the excuse of hospital is spooky whenever weird things happened. The answer here seemed to be that there was a weirdo who showed up and either killed people or stayed with them as they died. "Then how's he getting out without being seen?" Carl asked, clinging to hope. "Who knows?" I said. "How did that copy of Carol get out without anyone seeing her? How did David disappear into the stairwell for 3 days? Who's to say this guy isn't stuck in the stairwell too? Who's to say he didn't come from the stairwell in the first place? I really don't know, Carl. Could be something, could be nothing." Carl looked like he wanted to cry, but his face was refusing to open the floodgates. He'd been counting on me to give him an easy answer, and barring that, he knew he was going to have to do some digging. Whether it was a ghost or not, it was still killing patients, and in Cashmere Hospital, the management only took notice when whatever it was threatened them or their revenue. Looks like I got some detective work to do. That was about 2 weeks ago. Carl is no closer to finding the man in the red scrubs than he was when he asked me to come to his office. The rumor around the hospitals are that he doesn't leave his office much these days. The day security reports that they can't use the small space because Carl's in there at all hours, running through security footage. He's pulled records on all the deaths within the last few months and has asked the local police to get an autopsy on the 2 who died recently. He has friends in the sheriff's office, or this request would have likely been met with derision. People come to me with these things, knowing that Carl and I are friends, but I don't have answers for them either. He may not have a lot of answers, but he does have more evidence. "I found him on the cameras 2 more times, Carl said, sounding downright gleeful as he leaned against my desk. "I'm trying to get permission to access the camera archives so I can go back further. The ones I have access to only go back about 6 months. He's been at 2 other fatal code blues, and when I showed it to a buddy of mine who's a detective, he says that's a definite pattern." I was glad that Carl was making headway, but it appeared that he had done nothing but look for this guy since Monday. The underarms of his uniform were concernedly dark, and some of the stains looked old and smeary. There was a smell about him that led me to believe that he might not have been showering regularly either. "That's some solid progress, Carl. Any clue where he's disappearing to?" His face fell a little then, but he wouldn't be derailed. "No, but I'm not sure he's leaving the hospital at all. We can't find any sign of him leaving the stairwell once he enters, and I think he might be getting onto the roof somehow without triggering the alarm." Someone came in through the front door, but as they caught sight of Carl, they turned and headed for the elevators. I couldn't say I could blame them either. Despite looking like a homeless security guard and smelling like a fast food dumpster, Carl just had this presence now, something he hadn't had on Monday when he decided to do his research. It was hard to pin down, at least it would be for normal people, but he reminded me of the mental patients you sometimes saw walking the halls. He had a manic gleam in his eye, a mania that seemed to have taken hold of him, and I was worried that he might become yet another odd presence for the hospital to use in its strange designs. Watching him go through it was more horrific than any manifestation the hospital had thrown my way yet, made worse because Carl was a friend. Carl, maybe it's best to kick this up the line to the cops. If this guy is killing people, then maybe it's best to let the professionals handle it. Carl looked at me like he didn't quite understand me for a second, some of his sanity trying to claw back up before his obsession took hold again. "I gotta get back to it," he said, shuffling off like a lost child. I'll see you later." As he left, I felt dread building in me. Much like Danny Torrance, it was frightening to watch someone you respected transform before your eyes into someone you don't recognize. I would have to watch him closely, lest the hospital claim yet another victim. Faith sat at the keyboard and prepared to create. The document cursor blinked cheerfully at her as she waited for her muse to inspire her, as it had before. She had written 3 best-selling novels and 1 turd sandwich that she was still trying to swallow. Her ill-chosen break into the world of adult romance, 7 Sons, had bombed about as hard as a book could. But it was time for Faith to get back on that horse and try again. After a year of producing nothing but bad traffic for every book reviewer who read 7 Sons, her bank account was starting to dwindle, and it was time to mount that horse or put him in the barn forever. The whirring of the blades let her know they were close behind her. It had been a 1 in a million chance, a chance at freedom or a chance at death, and Cadence had beaten the odds, it seems. She should feel lucky. Most people in Fairest only looked at their tickets every week and felt like losers. Cadence was the lucky lotto winner, but not of a prize that anyone wanted. Cadence had won the right to be killed by her friends and neighbors. Cadence had won the right to... A spidery laugh crept from behind her as her fingers froze on the keys. She looked around the office, trying to see where the source of the laughter had come from. Was the TV on? The laughter hadn't sounded normal. It had sounded mechanical. She wondered if maybe the TV had come on in the living room or something like that, but put it out of her mind as she went back to writing. The laughter had rankled her. She'd spent far too long being laughed at. 7 Sons should have been a hit. The formula was there, the chemistry was there, and with her name on it, it should have sold just as well as the other 3 books. It was the story of a noblewoman stranded on a desert planet with a series of suns rising one behind the other. The planet was barren, a wasteland, owned by a despot and his army of mercenaries. The woman's only chance for survival was to take sanctuary with the native Barsonans, who opposed the Baron. She falls in love with Fabian, a desert guide who leads her to their king, and their love blossoms in the shadow of war. It should have been a hit, a romance sci-fi masterpiece. It had bombed almost before she'd even released it. Cadence looked at her mother, that pillar of strength in a world of perpetual disappointment. Her father and brother were still for once, their forks stalling in their rooting through the contents of their TV trays. They looked at her now with something other than their usual indifference. They looked at her now like a pack of wild dogs looking at a bowl of steak. They knew what killing her would net them, and they didn't care about the ties of blood that bound them. Failure, came a gentle chuckle in her left ear. Cadence shuddered and twisted violently in her chair. She looked around the room furtively, trying to find the source of the voice. It had to be the TV or something. There was no one else in the apartment but her. It was early evening, the shadows gathering outside her window, making her think that dusk would settle soon. She'd only been up a few hours, preferring to write at night. What use did she have for being awake during the day anyway? Just one more reason for her editor to yell at her. This was all her fault anyway. She was the one who had suggested trying something different. They had been at lunch when she told her about her intentions to write a romance novel. They were sitting in Louie's, out on the patio, and Joyce had asked her if she'd thought about her next book yet. This was back when she was still the golden child of Norma Publishing, her 5 years on the New York Times bestseller list still fresh in their mind, and Joyce had been wild to get her next bestseller. "A romance novel?" she asked, squeezing lemons into her tea. "It's not really your thing, but it couldn't hurt." "Well, I was thinking of doing something in a romance sci-fi, but with more of an emphasis on the romance." Joyce nodded, the ice cubes clinking in her glass. "Well, it doesn't sound too bad. As long as you can write a romance as well as you can write science fiction, then I'd say we should have another hit on our hands." Turns out, Faith couldn't deliver in the end. "Run, Cadence!" her mother shouted, and Cadence felt her feet guide her back towards the kitchen. As her father lumbered to his feet, the TV tray spilling onto the carpet, Cadence heard his feet tangle in the tray as he went down. Her two brothers, boys she had helped raise while her mother was at work and her father was in an inebriate coma, came lumbering up as well, and she threw the kitchen door back into Brett's face as he ate up the carpet with his runner's legs. He made a sound like a tapped keg of beer and stumbled back, but Travis shoved the door and was in the kitchen before she could escape out the back. Cadence cried out as she struggled with the locks, tears streaming down her face as she expected to be caught in Travis's hands any minute. She shuddered as that scrabbly laughter scuttled across her eardrums again. She looked over at the window, but knew it was closed. Besides, no one laughed like that. No one except the audience in sitcoms. The laughter was fake. Fake as her blonde hair. Blondes sell more books, Joyce had said, so her muddy brown hair had become a dazzling blonde. No glasses on any of the book jackets that bore her picture either. The contacts changed her eyes from green to blue, and thus Faith Moore became Faye Moore, with nothing but a little makeup and some well-placed deception. No one except the people she'd gone to school with knew what she looked like. No one besides the people she'd gone to school with ever laughed at her. Cadence heard the grating of wood as someone grabbed the chair from the table. "No good," said that spidery voice, but she ignored it. She yanked at the door again, but realized that the second deadbolt was still on, and twisted it fervently. She gritted her teeth against the laughter of that make-believe audience, her life beginning to feel like a bad Friends skit. See Phoebe struggling to write something. See Rachel bent over a spreadsheet as she worked. Watch them suffer, watch them toil, and listen to the audience lap it up. That was comedy, right? Watching somebody else struggle, while you sat back and watched. She heard the heavy thunk of the wood, and believed that she must go unconscious at any minute. He would brain her with that chair, had probably already brained her with the chair, and she was just lying on the floor as her head went right on believing she was conscious. She would wake up in the less-than-loving arms of the Lottery Commission, if she ever woke up at all, and that would be all for her less-than-impressive 20 years of life. She caught the dark spot out of the corner of her eye, that cradle of darkness, and imagined that she could still see something hunched there. What was it? She didn't know, but she felt certain that she would feel something watching her from there. As the night came on outside and the shadows stretched into true darkness, Faith became more and more certain that something was watching her from that pocket. Was it making the laughing noise she was hearing? Was it what she was afraid of now, as she sat working on her manuscript? As scared as she was, her well-trained fingers kept right on tapping away, too locked in their own monotony to stop now. They called to her, these creatures of darkness. They wanted her talented hands, her nimble mind, to write for them an opus. They needed her, but she was afraid. Faith feared what lay within that darkness, that soupy moor of uncertainty, but as she denied them, she only stoked their desire for her. Their trade was fear. their nourishment, hopeless mirth, and they needed her smiling face to... Faith had been watching the darkness and not paying attention to her fingers. She growled as she erased what she had written, returning to the story of Cadence and her unlucky lotto night. What the hell had that been? Faith had never written anything like that in her life. Heck, her sci-fi was even considered a little too dystopian to really fit the genre. She wrote stories about heroines in their late teens who subverted expectations and toppled greedy hegemonies, the usual soulless crap that readers 25 to 35 ate up and told their friends about. That had been the problem with Seven Sons, she now realized too late. The audience didn't want a love story. They wanted the same cookie-cutter situations that Faith, or rather Faye, always brought them. Leave the horror for the guys like King and Kuntz, and leave the romance for paperback sections at grocery stores. Faith knew her place now, and she wouldn't be sliding out of it again. There had been a time, though, hadn't there? Faith put it out of her mind as she typed, but it refused to lie down. There had been a time when she'd stepped into that darkness, a time that she didn't like to think about, because it made her feel strange. "Come on," Travis said, and Cadence realized he'd been pushing the back door open as she sat cowering. "The chair won't hold for long. If you're gonna run, now's the time." Something was in that shadowy corner. Faith just knew it. From the corner of her eye, she could almost see it grinning at her. She could feel something like tiny prickles slinking up her back. The thought of someone being in here made her feel very vulnerable. In the 10 years she'd lived alone, she had never felt so isolated, and as she reached shakily for her cup of pens, she made sure that her hands continued typing so as to keep up appearances. Cadence just gaped at him, thankful in a way that she couldn't begin to put to words. Clearly it hadn't all been for nothing. Brett had fallen into the same trap her father had, but Travis, there was still some of the sweet boy that had always been there. She didn't thank him, didn't really feel capable of words, but she loped off like a startled deer, moving into the night as she made her escape. The cup went flying, and as it crashed into the corner, Faith made her own escape. She dashed for the door, her hands closing around the knob as her other hand flipped on the lights. She was hoping to blind them after startling them with the cup, but as the lights came on, Faith saw that there was no one to startle. Except for the small arrangement of scattered pins, there was nothing there. She stared at the spot for a few seconds before bursting into laughter of her own. She was such an idiot. Faith had gotten spooked for some reason and let her imagination get the better of her. She took a few steps towards the corner, meaning to pick up the pins, but as she bent to grab the slightly dented mesh cup, she heard a different sort of mechanical laughter as it suddenly snickered from the living room. Faith stood up slowly as she looked at the wall like she might be able to see through it. Faith walked slowly towards the door, hands shaking as she took the knob, her fear back in force. The hallway beyond was dark, but Faith could see the soft light of her flat screen lighting the living room with an eerie glow. She put her back to the wall, slowly creeping up the hall as she tried to stop her teeth from clattering together. She could hear the banter between two familiar characters, and Faith believed that the TV might be playing an episode of How I Met Your Mother. Faith could see her cream-colored sectional as she came closer and saw the remote sitting in between two cushions, right where she had left it. She reached around the corner, feeling for the switch, and as it came on, she leapt around, preparing to catch whoever had turned the TV on. The living room and the kitchen were clean, the chain and the bolt still engaged on her front door, and the house was empty, other than her. Faith pursed her lips, walking over to the couch and picking up the remote as she switched the TV off. She had cut Ted off in the middle of his complaint, but it hardly mattered. Faith had seen this episode loads of times. She hardly needed to see it again. Faith had watched a lot of TV in the past year, her mind too flustered to think about much. She had stayed on her couch as she tried to ignore the reviews online for Seven Sons, not wanting to see all the hate they had spilled there. The book had been a total flop. People had bought the book thinking it was more of her dystopian works and were not impressed by a love story. They said that Lady Stasian was a paper heroine with no real use other than to give male characters something to chase, and they found Fabian to be too familiar to any number of other characters. They compared the book to Dune or Star Wars or any number of other books, and not in a positive way. The reviews were cutting, often snide, and they just seemed to be used as an excuse to make fun of Faith. How could a writer so talented put something like this out? How could she read over this and think it was a good story? The characters were two-dimensional and sort of ruined the vibe of her book once I realized that it was not even her first offense. Someone at Norma Publishing was asleep at the wheel when they thought this thing was finished. Faith had started out trying to defend her work, but after a while, she just stopped going online to check. Joyce didn't seem to mind her going to ground. Her reputation at Norma had soured a little, though they could still take some of the responsibility for the book. They had published it after all, and a lot of Joyce's frigidness seemed mean-spirited. Faith shook out of her funk, finding herself just sitting and staring at the dark TV, and got up as she prepared to get back to work. Joyce would change her tune once she had sent out her latest work. Lotto Night would be her return to the written world, at least for something rather than scorn and laughter. When she got back to her desk, however, she was in for a surprise. Her manuscript was gone. The document she had left open was closed, and the file was nowhere to be found. She searched the desktop, the trash bin, and the folders on her desktop, but couldn't find anything. There was no trace of it. There was nothing there, all except a new document that she couldn't recall having seen before. The title was The Old Manuscript. Faith clicked on it, certain it hadn't been there when she started looking. The longer she read, the more she came to doubt that she had written it. These were things that Faith hadn't thought about in years. A girl once befriended a shadow. Her sisters were afraid of the strange shadow that often scuttled across their room, but the girl was taken with it. She thought the shadows were funny, them and their big smiles. She would stay up sometimes and watch them as they played, giggling at them as they scuttled across the ceiling and walls. Even at such a young age, she began to create stories about her shadow friends. She created a place for them to go during the daytime, things for them to do while they waited for night, and adventures for them to undertake as the sun shone down. She whispered the stories at night to the shadows, and they were enraptured by them. No one had ever talked to them before. Most people were just afraid. The shadows loved her stories so much that they let her peek into their strange world, showing her their world in her dreams. The lands of Strange were much different than she had imagined, and the girl began to write about the places she saw there. The shadows were making something, assembling people that the girl didn't know, and the more she saw, the more she wrote. The adventures of her shadows became less friendly, less childish, but more accurate. She became their chronicler, and the more she wrote, the darker she felt. Gone was the happy little girl, and in her place, she became a quiet child. Her parents didn't understand her new job, so they sealed it away. The lady made her forget in her slow, powerful words, and the girl forgot her shadows. They sealed her words away, not quite daring to destroy them. But though forgotten, the shadows were never gone. When her family died suddenly in the night, the girl was the only survivor. They laughed and laughed at the shadows' antics, but the girl could only watch in horror. She went away then, the lady making her forget again before the memories could hurt her too badly. The shadows, however, the shadows remembered, and bided their time. It grew darker as she read through the story. The more she read, the more she remembered. and Faith could feel the tears spilling from her eyes. How had she forgotten? How was it even possible to have forgotten? Her Aunt Terry had taken her after the incident, the police calling it a gas leak, and taken her to Dr. Winters one last time. The woman had made her forget, taken away the real memories like she had before, and now it was like a magic picture you couldn't unsee. She remembered now. She remembered being woken up by her sisters screaming as the shadows scrambled across every surface of their room. She remembered her parents bursting into the room just as her sisters began to chuckle. She remembered her father getting angry, thinking this was all a joke, but then beginning to chuckle himself. They laughed and laughed as she sat there in horror, the smiling shadows filling the room with midnight, until she blacked out. She woke up on the back porch as an officer shook her awake. She had dreamed of them sometimes, but Dr. Winter had done her job well, and they were never seen as anything but simple nightmares. She could feel them surrounding her again, see them approaching her from the shadows, but her fear was tempered with something else. She turned in her chair, watching them come closer, and the smile that tried to stretch her face was confused as the tears continued to fall. They came towards her, and Faith scooted back until she realized she was trapped. They had pushed her up against the desk, and now she was stuck in the trap they had created. Despite it all, she felt the desire to laugh creeping up her throat, like the start of a cold after a good night's sleep. As she cringed away, one of them extended a hand to her. Faith saw an ancient box held in it, and she knew what would be inside when she opened it. Still, she was surprised to see the curling edges of her original bunch of stories nestled at the bottom. She took it out, holding it between her shaking hands like an ancient relic from a bygone time. "We need your writing again, Faith," the shadow said, smiling hugely as its voice rasped out oddly. "There's a project that we need your beautiful mind to see to fruition." Faith tried to answer him, but her words were lost amongst the racking laughter that scuttled up her throat. Her laughter sounded odd, brittle, like the laughter you heard from the windows of an insane asylum. It sounded like the laughter you'd hear rising from the pits of hell. The laughter wouldn't stop her, though. Quite the contrary. Faith chuckled as she wrote, the smile hurting her mouth. Who cared about suns and desert planets and dystopian teens and their problems? Faith had a higher calling now, and the laughter must be served. My boss was smiling as he tossed the flyer on my desk. I could see Jasper and Marcus turning to smile at me as well as I picked up the notice and scowled at it. I've been at Farseer News for about 6 months now, but it's far from my first brush with journalism. I used to write for a news source in Washington. I won't name them. They probably don't want to be brought into all of this. And before that, I wrote for my college newspaper. That's where I received my degree in English and journalism. And that was back when my future seemed bright. I worked as a journalist for 6 years, but that was before everything went to hell. I won't go into details, but it was a story that everyone said I should have left alone. I wouldn't, though. I was young and still looking for my big break, and the story seemed perfect. It was, I guess, perfectly capable of ripping my career to shreds, that is. When it was all said and done, no one would touch me. Couldn't even get a job cleaning toilets in a building with news ties, and I'd thought it was over. Until the call came from Farseer. It's a paper in Gavin, one of the largest cities in the tri-state area, but it's as far from D.C. as it gets in terms of journalism. Out here I'd be covering cattle auctions and ladies' auxiliary bake sales and state fairs. I started to turn them down, but after some rumination and a lot of alcohol, I decided that it might be just the thing to fix my credibility. Maybe after a few years of writing about less sensational stories, I could go back to writing about, serious topics again. I could fix my image, maybe find a little public corruption to open the shades on, and get on with something more grand. I could work my way back into the industry and get my name back. Then I'd find somewhere away from politics and get back on my feet. I couldn't have known, however, that the head of my department was someone who liked to screw with people. My boss, Andrew, and his buddies, Jasper and Marcus, are as far from journalists as you can get. They all have degrees from the local community college in English or journalism, but the dynamic around the bullpen is more like the one you'd find in the office. Andrew is the Michael Scott of our department, handing down judgments and comedy in equal parts. Marcus is like a less likable Jim, and Jasper is the Stanley, older and constantly sleeping through his deadlines. I guess that makes me the Dwight, and they don't mind using me for the butt of their jokes. You should have seen Andrew during my interview as he realized my credentials. He looked almost gleeful at the prospect of having a real journalist on his team that he could mess with. Case in point, the flyer he had just tossed down was for the closing of a local institution in the neighboring town of Foreman. The closing of a discount warehouse store that had existed on the corner of Beck and Mills since the Depression. "What's this?" I said, looking up from a story that I'd been writing about last week's big event. "That is your assignment for today, old junior field journalist." Junior field journalist was another thing that Andrew had made up to demean me. He knew I'd been a hotshot columnist in the big city and decided to take me down a peg with the big stories he handed down. The stories were everything from dog fashion shows to pumpkins that looked a little like Elvis. He found the obscure stories seemingly from nowhere, and he handed them to me with the air of someone bestowing great honor on a lesser. He mostly did it so he and the other community college journalists could laugh at me as I went off to chase the story. "Can't anyone else do this? I'm working on the governor's Clean Air Initiative piece." "Actually, I sent your notes over to Jasper, so you'd have a free afternoon to give this story your full attention." I ground my teeth and listened to my molars groan like sails in a high breeze. "You did what?" "No need to thank me. I mean, it's not every day that a historic institution like the discount warehouse goes out of business. We want your full attention on this story so you can tell us all about the last great sale on this time capsule of Americana. Feel free to use that line if you like," he said, walking off as Marcus and Jasper snickered at me. The whole thing just felt way too much like the actions of a cartoon villain. With little choice left, I packed up my things and went off to chase the story. I was fuming as I drove the 30-odd miles to Foreman. I was tired of being treated this way by people who had learned everything about news reporting from their high school AV club. The stories that the Farseer took on were often fluff pieces, and sometimes even borderline tabloid news. For every serious story we took on, there were a dozen others about beauty pageant winners and food-eating contests, and pieces just labeled local color. I was sick of being stuck with these nothing filler bits. What's worse is that they weren't even anything you could hang a new career on. No respectable paper would want to see your name attached to a drunken fiddle contest, and no one would be impressed by my dissertation on the Little Miss Southwest regional pageant. I'd been hoping to craft this into a new start, but it looked like I'd be stuck at the Farseer for the foreseeable future. The money was nice, though, so I guess that was a plus. The interstate was fairly uneventful, and I arrived in Foreman without too much fanfare. When they tell you that Gavin is the largest city in the tri-state area, they mean it. Gavin, as it happens, has a population of about 25,000 on a good census year. The whole area is very rural, which means there's a lot of very nice cow fields and pigs to look at as you drive. Gavin has 5 restaurants, a city hall, a public pool, a drive-in, several strip malls that are slowly expiring, and a Walmart that's usually being sold by one of the $5 generals in the area. There's 20 traffic lights in the whole town, and the rest of the roads are watched over by stop signs and good manners. If Gavin is a big town, then Foreman is a pothole. You can tell when you're pulling into Foreman because of the seemingly endless array of trailer parks on the outskirts. They have cute little names like Shady Pines and Whispering Oaks or Sunnydale, but what they amount to is a sea of plastic and chrome that stretches for well over 10 miles. I'm pretty certain that the trailer parks are bigger than the whole town, but that's just a guess. As sad as all that humanity on display is, the town is downright tragic. There was once a thriving burg here, I've been told, but it relied mostly on the pulpwood industry and the small coal mining operation that took place in the area. Now the coal's played out, the pulpwood's going out, and Foreman is a town that seems unaware that it's dying. If you drive up the main street, you can see more buildings for rent than that are open. It has a city municipal building that doubles as a city hall, a working railroad that will likely outlive the town, and several strip malls with the usual collection of pizza joints and cell phone stores. A few pawn shops and hardware stores seem to be struggling along, but the only thing in Foreman doing any business is the Moosehead pub and the small local police force waiting for drunks outside said pub. I suppose the lack of business was why I was here, though. I kept expecting to see a Walmart or at least a Dollar General or a Family Dollar, but the longer I drove without seeing one, the odder it felt. Had Discount Warehouse been that big of an institution? I suppose the little discount chains would pop up like mushrooms now that Thriftmeyer was forced to loosen his grip on the region. Discount Warehouse sat in a historical building that had once been a Thriftmeyer all-goods store. Mr. Thriftmeyer, who I assume had changed his name for marketing reasons, had owned a chain of Thriftmeyer all-goods stores across the Tri-County area. They rebranded as Discount Warehouse in the late 70s and incorporated furniture and housewares into the business model. Discount Warehouse was more like a small Walmart or a large Dollar General, and the economy had started weeding them out in the late 2000s. This was the last of the Thriftmeyer line, and today would end his legacy as a houseware and small appliance juggernaut. You like that? It's the opening of my article, and all with nothing more than 30 minutes in the car and a Google search. I did a little more looking and discovered that the Thriftmeyers still own the chain. Thriftmeyer Sr. had died around the time of the rebranding, 1978 it said, but his son was just as business savvy as his old man, it appeared. Jacob Thriftmeyer Jr. had been running his father's store since the mid-20s, and he was still managing the store well into his 80s. The article said that he had hoped to rebrand again and keep the business open, but the bank had other ideas and would no longer extend their loan. The store had been operating in the red for years, and the tab had finally come due. Jacob Thriftmeyer had begrudgingly signed over his business to the bank and was getting ready to enter retirement. I felt for the old guy, but I suppose all good things had to come to an end. I wasn't exactly sure I would call the parking lot I was currently in a good thing, however. The building was a large brick box with a black awning that appeared to have been added after the fact. The doors were not the fancy sliding ones that most stores had, but large glassed ones with handles that jutted out from the front. The concrete parking lot was old and rutted, the pavement in sad need of leveling and replaning. The people who had gathered here looked like cattle at an auction, and they all just sort of milled about aimlessly. There were some kids among them, pale youths holding their parents' hands, and it was here that I saw some emotion. Most of them were jittering around like kids will do, and all of them seemed to possess a certain air of excitement. As I got out of the car, notebook in hand, I went to join the collected humanity. I heard the snap of an elastic from overhead and looked up to see small flags that had been hung on a rope running from the awning to the light poles that dotted the parking lot. They were black and white, the wind pushing them aimlessly, and it made me think of a funeral. This whole event was a funeral, I supposed, and as I got close, a banner fell to block the awning, and the illusion was complete. It was black with white letters, and the sentiment seemed very fitting later on. "Everything must go," it proclaimed, and the sight of it gave me the willies. A small stage had been erected, and there was a cheery man in a cheap suit standing beside an old, stooped man in a much nicer suit. He had to be Jacob Thriftmeyer, Jr., but the younger man was unknown to me. He was beaming out at the crowd, looking happy to be there, or anywhere on such a day as this. He glanced towards the sky as the wind snapped at the flags, and his smile seemed to wither a little. The clouds were becoming dark, and it looked like the weather might wash out the last great deal of the discount warehouse. Would everything still go in the rain? I supposed it would, and I was right. I wish I hadn't been. I'm proud to see so many of Foreman's finest out to say goodbye to the city's institution that's been here since the town was little more than a logging hub. Logging hub might have been a stretch, but I supposed this was the mayor of Foreman. I've shopped here with my family for as long as I can remember, and the deals we've all found at the discount warehouse were like nothing seen anywhere else. Jacob Thriftmeyer has helped keep the specter of corporate greed from overtaking our town, and we will be sorry to see him go. Mr. Thriftmeyer himself would like to say a few words, and I think we owe him that much." The applause were scattered and half-hearted, and the old man approached the mic slowly before trying to lower it to his level. The banner kept catching my attention, and it just seemed off somehow. Everything must go. I'd never thought about that statement before, but it was a little foreboding if you looked at it in a certain light. The kind of light that hovered around here, for example. Everything must go. If everything went, then what would be left? Would Foreman remain? Would Gavin be safe? How much would be left behind once everything had gone? The reedy voice of Jacob Thriftmeyer, Jr. brought me back to the stage. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My father opened up Thriftmore All Goods a year before the Great Depression sunk its claws into this country. I have strived to keep his legacy afloat, but it seems I have failed. I have failed this town. I failed all of you. And now we must pay the price." I furrowed my brow as I took a shorthand missive of the speech. This was a weird one, even for the ramblings of a geriatric store owner. The people seemed as confused as he was, but the children seemed to know already. While the parents stood in polite boredom, the children were looking around with what I thought was excitement, but I quickly realized was fear. Their neck hair was up for some reason, and they all seemed on the edge of fleeing. It was like house pets just before a tornado hits. They sense the change in pressure, the change in the air, but they can do nothing but wait for it to hit and hope it doesn't simply squash them flat. That should have been a warning, but I ignored it yet again. I was here to get a story, and I meant to be done with it before the whole day was wasted. "This store held the town together, in hard times and good times. Many of you have bought your furniture here for your first place, the crib for your first baby, the groceries for your last meal. But today, it all comes to an end. Today is the final moments of Foreman. So, drink them in while you can." The mayor was looking at him oddly, some of those who had come to watch looking as if his words had broken through their daze. The children, however, stood straight as fence posts, just waiting for whatever was to come. They seemed to sense the portents and I remember thinking that some of them might make it out, though I didn't know why the thought had occurred. Make it out of what? What would they need to escape? I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but this store has not existed on its own for all these years. When my father opened his doors in 1932, he was full of hope for the future. He just knew that this would bring his family stability, bring them wealth, and so it did. Even through the Great Depression, Dad made money hand over fist, and he was very generous with the community. Foreman thrived because of my father's money. But somewhere along the way, you all forgot that. The mayor's pasted-on smile was beginning to slip, but when he reached for the mic, Jacob Thriftmeyer gave him a stony look, and he backed away. Thriftmeyer was going to say his piece, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. It's true, and you all know it's true. I kept the riffraff out. I kept the Dollar Generals and the Family Dollars and even the likes of Sam Walton's monstrosity out of this town. And how did you all repay me? You turned your noses up at the local businesses, at the businesses that had made this town great, and you drove to Gavin or Bryson or he spat onto the hot top, McAllister, to shop at Walmart and Target and Costco as the town died around you. You put pennies over people, and now you reap what you have sown. He looked out across the crowd, looking furious with them as they looked down sheepishly. I was astonished. Did he blame them for the fall of his empire? Don't bother looking contrite. I know what all of you think. I know you think that those vultures will be here to nibble my corpse once my store is closed. But you are wrong. You don't live as long as I have without picking up some tricks. And today, I give you all my last deal. He wetted his lips, preparing to speak the words that must be spoken. He turned to the doors, and when he thrust his hands toward them, they opened to reveal the horror they had been holding at bay. Everything must go! As he said it, the doors came open and a thick black smoke came pouring out. It was almost like floating tar, the cloud impenetrable as it hovered out. The effect was galvanizing. The sleepy crowd began to murmur and then to back away. They were unsure what to make of this, but as they got closer, they began to scream and run from the encroaching smoke bank. Some of them, however, stood mesmerized by it. Some walked towards it, and those who disappeared into it were lost within that smoke. I saw most of this, however, from the inside of my car. The final declaration, the negation of the town itself, had moved me as it had moved the doors, and I was bringing my car to life before I realized I had moved at all. The car seemed sluggish to start, the engine making a sleepy grinding noise as it came to life, and before pulling away from the store, I looked back at the old man as he stood atop the podium. His hands were raised in exaltation, his eyes cast skyward, and as the cloud pressed against his back, I thought it might reject him for the briefest of moments. Then it gobbled him up, along with the stunned mayor, and I was leaving the lot on squealing tires. As I drove out of town, I saw the smoke rising behind me. It swallowed the town in a plume of thick gray death, but it seemed I was the only vehicle leaving town. The people I passed on the sidewalk, the ones coming out to look at the cloud, seemed to be mesmerized by all that smoke. They didn't run like the others had, the ones out in front of the store, and I was tempted to stop and shout at them. I wanted them to run, to escape the smoke, but most of them seemed to have accepted their fate. The farther I drove, the more I feared that the smoke would never stop and would simply engulf everything. Every mile I drove, the less I believed I would make it home. When I made it to my apartment, it hardly filled me with a sense of serenity. I'm on the couch now, my phone ringing off the hook as the office tries to get a hold of me. They want to know the same thing the news anchors want to know. What happened to Foreman? They say the town is simply missing, the smoke cloud having cleared to reveal raw earth and nothing else. The streets, the buildings, the trailer parks, the main street, everything was gone. It had been removed down to the dirt, and no one seemed to have escaped whatever it was that had happened. They were looking for witnesses, for anyone with information, and my boss and his friends seemed to be doing the same. I guess I was the only one who'd seen what happened, and it was something that would stick with me for a long time. I don't know what to do now, but I know one thing for sure. The sign didn't lie. Everything had to go, so everything went. Welcome back for another visit to Cashmere. It's your favorite night guard here again for another update from Cashmere Botanical Gardens. Today marks about a month since our grand reopening, and today we open our brand new tree exhibit. And if you thought the moving guardian tree was unsettling, then wait till you see what we have today. The fourth ring is now home to the trees with human faces. On the first day of the exhibit's grand opening, 3 trees were sitting in the ring, each with a different face. One was the face of a young man, complete with wavy hair that ran down his back and into the bark. The second was a middle-aged man, his glasses immaculately carved into the front of the wood. The third was the most chilling, an old woman with a ghostly O for a mouth and a gray bun that sat atop her head. Her face was frozen in shock, and she looked as if her last moments had been truly horrific. The people came to see them from across the county, and they even had some postcards printed up with their likeness. They were intrigued by the carvings, and I didn't correct them as I maybe should have. I knew that no knife had carved those faces. I'd watched her ladyship grow them herself, and they had sprung from the ground with the faces emblazoned in the wood. It's an honor to watch the lady work. She's so delicate, so precise, and she walks her plants through the stage of life like a video in fast motion. The lily pond was where she seemed to do most of her work, and it was there that she made her most impressive constructs. I was lucky enough to be asked to help tonight. She put together the trees with the faces, and it's something that I'll never forget. She'd gathered a few of us around her, and helping seemed to be her way of asking us to lend some of the essence that she had gifted us with. I'd helped before. The old-growth forest had taken a lot of energy and a lot of sessions, but it was worth it to get to watch her shape the wood and the plants. She drew a seed from the depths of the lily pond, the surface swirling with effort as she aged it from a seed to sapling, from sapling to tree. The leaves and branches began to sprout. The roots began to run, and as the face appeared, I remember gasping in surprise. It was as startling then as it was now, and I watched the teenage boy take shape upon the wood with startling clarity. She moved her hands like a maestro, weaving a symphony of wood before finally letting it splash into the pond, her work completed. Please, take it to the fourth ring, and be sure it has enough room to stretch. It will have company soon. True to her word, she made 2 others that night, and now they all stood within the ring, with room for more to come. No one seemed to question how 3 fully grown trees had simply risen from the Georgia soil, seemingly overnight, but they came in droves to see them. We usually had to keep a close watch over the new exhibits, guests wanting to climb inside for a closer look. But these trees seemed to be the exception. The guests crowded the barriers, snapped their pictures, and looked on in wonder. But they didn't get too close to these odd bits of flora. I suppose maybe it was something uncanny about the details on the human face. Or maybe they, like me, thought they might bite if they got too close. No one seemed in a hurry to cross the metal bar that separated the exhibits from the park. They were only a little freaky at first, but after only a week of being introduced to the park, they shifted into something downright spooky. One night, they started whispering. I was on night shift, something I like to do more often than not, and as I came around the fourth ring, I heard someone talking in a low voice. I looked around for other brandy-low, but I couldn't find anyone besides myself near the exhibit. It wasn't really like someone talking quietly either, not like a secret conversation or anything. It was more like someone whispering, someone who whispers instead of talks, and has gotten quite comfortable with it. The longer I listened, the more it sounded like a constant stream of spidery words, the kind that crawl across your ears from the mouth of an open mausoleum or from a cave at night. It was the skittering voice of the damned, and the closer I got to the exhibit, the surer I was that I didn't want to see who was talking. Coming within sight of the ring, I could see the light from the nearby lamppost as it lit the hellish faces, and I was unsurprised to see the lips of one moving in painful, creaking groans. It was the old woman, and the effort of speech seemed to be causing her as much pain as the tree itself. The wood creaked and groaned, unused to movements of that kind, and the whispers were coming from a throat with no opening. Her eyes had been brown and sightless just this morning, staring out into the park, but now they possessed a glassiness that made me think they were capable of sight. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could hear it from across the barrier, and knew that the guests would be able to hear it tomorrow if it continued. I wanted to go to the lady, wanted to go to Randy, but also found that I wanted to hear what wisdom came from her. I had learned from my time as a brandy-low, as short as it had been, that there was wisdom in natural things, especially the old one. Rayffered and I had had many such talks while I was on shift, and the things he told me were amazing. He had seen the Ice Age, lived through the tectonic shift, and had seen many different peoples come and go. The tree was newer, but what knowledge could be taken from their wooden hearts? My curiosity led me to do something that none of the guests had been brave enough to do, and I jumped the barrier and approached the old woman. Her eyes stared ahead, their gaze fixed at the stars that twinkled beyond the glare of the lamplight. She was whispering, as if she needed to get her truth out before her breath was taken, and the closer I slunk, the more I came to realize it was the same thing again and again. It wasn't a story. It wasn't even really a conversation. It was the same 3 or 4 sentences, again and again, as she told her tales to the stars. I moved in closer, afraid to put my ear too close, but wanting to hear it all. Pretty lady calls me. Pretty lady on the island calls for me to come to her. I stepped into the water, but the roots drug me down. I saw her looking down at me as I sank beneath the water, smiling as my bubbles rose. It was chilling, but she kept saying it again and again. I was less enthusiastic as I left, and when she stopped whispering it around 5 o'clock, I was glad I wouldn't have to listen to her throughout the day. I knew that no matter where I was, that voice would follow me. The whispering came back for the next 2 nights, always the same pitch, and always the same words. On the second night, however, the middle-aged man began to speak as well. I knew that something was different when I walked past the 3rd ring and heard a different voice as I approached the 4th. I had almost gotten used to the old lady as she whispered ceaselessly, but tonight there was a new voice amongst the litany. It was deeper, but it still whispered. It rose above hers, but couldn't quite dwarf it. They mingled together, forming a chorus, and I was over the barrier before I could think better of it. I'd lost most of my trepidation over them. They were a cool mystery to figure out, and I was looking forward to learning more. She crooked her finger, promised me the experience of a lifetime. As I sank below the water, I thought of my wife and felt ashamed. The lady had been right. The last moments of my life were quite an experience. I shivered a little as he repeated. This one was different. He was talking about how the lady, my benefactor, had lured him to his death. It wasn't as if I hadn't seen her do it before. She had dragged Dr. Thurston into the depths and drowned him. Did I think he had been the only one? This place was known for mysterious disappearances. People still disappeared here, in fact. And I suppose they had to be going somewhere. I'd watched her work miracles from that pool, but I suppose there had to be a cost somewhere for such wonders. After that, I did go to Randy, but this was far from news to him. Yeah, sounds about right, he said. What do you mean it sounds about right? I asked, almost speechless. Their body is beneath the lily pond. We all know that. Hell, you saw the roots take Thurston and Carl. You think they were the only ones, did you? My face must have looked weird because he turned and put a hand on my shoulder. Won't do you any good to get upset about it. We're not human anymore, kid. The people below that water ain't either. Not anymore. They're meat now. Meat for the lady's table. Getting upset won't change it. Do your job. Serve the lady. Try not to think about the rest. I thought about that for the next few days as I walked my rounds, considering it all as I did my job. The job was all I really had left, as silly as that sounds. I was a creature with infinite time now, but I was still tied to the work I had been doing. This was my home now, I supposed, and the trees with faces weren't likely to be the strangest thing I ever saw. She had called my name 3 times before I looked up, and I immediately felt a cold chill run up me as I realized I had been ignoring my lady. My apologies, lady. I was lost in thought. It won't happen again. I'd gone to a knee, certain I was about to be scolded, but she smiled as she lifted me to my feet. Your thoughts are important, my Brandylow. I would never seek to break you from them. I was going for an evening stroll and was wondering if you would walk with me. Some nights I find that I could use the company. She offered me an arm, and this time I did not hesitate, as I had once upon a time. I had feared her, feared where she might lead me then, but I knew now that wherever she went, I would gladly follow. We were walking past the 4th ring, the murmuring still a chorus, when she stopped and smiled happily at the trees. Such interesting creations, are they not? They are, I answered, though I didn't look at them. I intend to make more of them, you know. There is much nourishment within the pool for them to take form from. My lady, may I ask you something? Of course, she said. You Brandylow are as children to me. I would refuse you nothing. Are the trees made from the people who go missing here? I knew the answer, but I wanted to know if she would tell me. They are, she said without hesitation. The creatures of this world are such wonderful nourishment for the flora that they try to trample. It's only right that they should give back after crushing so much of it beneath their dwellings and their deeds. I stopped, trying to find a way to ask so it wouldn't make me sound crazy. How is it that they talk? Are there souls there or something? She cocked her head, seeming to think about the answer. I don't know, she finally said, our route taking us past the old grove. It's possible that something of their old self is trapped inside the wood, an echo of who they once were that will live on past their bodies. I didn't consider them strong enough for such, but I suppose these humans may be more interesting than I give them credit for. She left me then, saying she was going to the pool to do some work. I'll unveil the newest tree tomorrow, so don't be late for the ceremony. Pleasant evening. I watched her go, not sure if I was excited for what would come in the morning or not, but knowing I would be there nonetheless. The next morning saw a small crowd arrive early for the unveiling of the latest piece for the exhibit. They couldn't believe that another tree would be added so soon, and most of the regulars couldn't wait to see what this one would look like. The new tree was already in place, and as I came up behind the crowd, I could hear them marveling at it. It had gone in just before opening, so I hadn't gotten a chance to peek last night, and as I came to the front to stop anyone from trying to get too close, I felt my breath stick in my throat. It appeared that the new tree was in honor of our old park director, the one who had disappeared after giving the lady her spot as chairman. Dr. Thurston's screaming face was visible from the front of the rich brown wood. His eyes were locked into something resembling sheer terror, and his mouth hung open in an eternal scream. The muscles of his face stood out like bands, and he looked like if he could talk, he wouldn't whisper. I dreaded the night he would add his voice to that chorus, but he never did. He did not whisper. For the next 3 weeks, whenever the sun went down, he screamed like a wounded cat. It was loud and long, a terrified wail that you could hear from across the park. They stopped whispering or yelling about a month later, and we were glad when Dr. Thurston was finally silent. By then, she had added a dozen other trees to the exhibit, and they all whispered their final eulogy for about a month before going silent. These were not the strangest of her creations, but they are the ones I remember the most. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear Dr. Thurston, and it reminds me that summer and spring can be just as brutal as the dead of winter. The lady is a being of great love and warmth, but that warmth can still burn her enemies. I know. It's been longer than you likely wanted to wait to hear more. I've been in a place the last few days that I've been calling the DGB-0. It's a place I've never been before, but it seems to be where Gale has been staying. There isn't any real difference between the DG-0 and any other store, but Gale has been living there for a long time, and says it's his kind of base of operation. What's more, Gale can bring things between stores. When I asked him how, he said it was a trick that he had learned and that he might teach me if he had time. I laughed. Time was something we seemed to have a lot of. I honestly couldn't tell you how long it's been or how long I've been here. It never gets light out. There are no clocks inside the store. My phone time changes, but sometimes the date and year jump ahead by years or back by centuries. Right now it says it's 3278 on Fronde in Mimtober in 1632. I haven't received any replies to any of my messages or posts, but I honestly haven't checked much. I don't even know if you guys are getting these anymore. I haven't seen a reply since the first installment, so I haven't really been responding. So, don't take it personal if you've been sending me messages and I haven't been getting back with you. I've certainly been a little busy, after all. But, on to what you're dying to know. Gale's a middle-aged guy, probably about 40 or 45. He's still wearing his Dollar General uniform, complete with name badge. He says that no matter what happens, it always comes back. The only thing that seems to stay with him are the bags under his eyes, and the guy looks tired. He made us dinner, soup and sandwiches, and toasted me with a pop from a brand I wasn't familiar with, but turned out to be ginger ale. After eating a couple of bowls of stew and about 3 sandwiches, I hadn't eaten much of substance in a few days, we started talking. I told him about my life as a wage slave, and he commiserated. I know what that's like. I had actually been transferred to this store when I got stuck here. How long ago was that? I asked, sitting back in the wicker chair that he had brought from somewhere else and listening to the comfortable creak. Who knows, Gale said. When I left the world as I knew it, it was 1998, and I'd just been sent to South Dakota to manage a new store. It's more pay, and you can pick your own crew, my boss had said, and I was glad for the money. My ex-wife had just petitioned for more child support, the 3rd time in as many years, and I was just trying to keep myself fed and in a bed and my head above water, he said with a laugh as he took a sip from the green can that it called itself Seofirm. So, I left Scottsdale, where I'd been managing one of the few remaining J.L. Turner & Sons, and after looking through some applications, I decided that I liked the look of Kenneth, Celine, and Margot. Oh yeah, wait, I remember there was another name on that memorial. When did Rudy come along? Gale looked away then, and I tried not to notice as he teared up a little. Oh, how could I forget Rudy? I'd been working at the store for a few months when he called me. Rudy was a lot older than his sister, from my first marriage when I was barely more than a kid myself, and he had been managing his own store in Texas. The store, however, had been burned down suddenly one night, and he was wondering if my store had any positions. I know you're the manager, Dad, but I'll do stock work if I need to. The noise around here makes me think that the locals don't like me being here, any more than they liked the store, and my apartment might go up in smoke next if I stay. Dollar General had run a few of the mom-and-pop stores in town out of business, you see, and the locals blamed Rudy and the DG for it. So, I called corporate and asked if I could get funding for one more worker, and Rudy came in to make it 5. We were tight-knit, working long hours and trying to compete with the local markets. The mom-and-pops in Chamberlain were dead set against losing business to us, but we held our ground and carved out a niche for ourselves. We didn't run the town, but we did okay. Then, one night, we got robbed. Margot and I were manning the front, Kenneth was in the back, and Celine was staying over to look at the books. She'd been an accountant before taking a job that was a little more flexible, and I had promised her some overtime if she could help me balance the receipts before our yearly audit next week. I wasn't even supposed to be there, but I was helping Margot through a busy time before the guy came in. We were getting ready to clean up after closing so we could pass the audit, and Rudy was coming in around 8 to help. We'd all clean for a while, and then maintain through Sunday, so we could be ready and fresh on Monday. We were just getting ready to close the doors at 8 when he barges in and pulls a gun. The guy had to be looking for drug money. He was out of his mind on something, and he rounded all of us up and put us behind the counter. He emptied the register, tried to get the safe, but it was on a timer that wouldn't even open till after 10, and made us empty our pockets and hand over our wallets. I was just thanking the universe that Rudy hadn't shown up when he popped up with a pizza after coming in through the employee back entrance. So, he joined the hostage situation. We all started out behind the counter, but the robber thought there might be a silent alarm back there. So he moved us all to the break room, but thought we might gang up on him in there. There was no door hanging on the break room, so there was no way to secure us. He finally decided to put us all in the bathroom and keep us pinned up there while he left. He herded us in through the door, and imagine our surprise when we came out in a different Dollar General. It was just like ours, except the doors wouldn't open. We didn't think about trying our way back through the bathroom and good thing, too. These Dollar Generals don't seem to look back on themselves. The bathroom only takes you to a different one, never back the way you came. But you go to different ones, I put in. He smiled. In time, my friend, in due time. You probably remember the first Dollar General you stayed in for a while. I imagine it got a little boring after a while, didn't it? I nodded, telling him it had only taken about a week for me to be done with it. Well, imagine that time times 5. First, it was a lot of fun. We played games, we spent time together, and kind of felt like a real family. Rudy and Margot had been having a not-so-secret relationship for months, and Celine and Kenneth and I had been hanging out a lot after work. We cooked dinners, we made crafts, we built puzzles, and for a while it was great. After a couple of weeks, though, we all started to go a little cabin crazy. The sun never rose, the lights never went out, and the door never opened. We didn't know how we were being kept here, but some of them started trying to find a way out. He took another sip of his ginger ale, and as he wetted his throat for the long story, he pressed on. It started with Kenneth. Kenneth was an avid hiker and liked to explore. He wanted to see if the space outside the Dollar General was the same as ours, but he couldn't get the door open. He pushed and pulled and tried to break the glass, tried to wedge the door open, but it was no use. He tried for 3 days to get outside, and on the 4th day, something unexpected happened. Something that showed the rest of us that we might not be as alone here as we'd thought. The door opened. Kenneth had been shoving at it for most of the day, trying to get the front doors open and failing miserably. He finally threw whatever he was using down, like a child having a tantrum, and kicked it half-heartedly with his foot. Then, to his astonishment, it opened as smoothly as it ever had. Outside was nothing but smooth darkness, like the waters of a deep lake by night. And when he took his first step, I told him not to. I felt like something out there was wrong, some place we weren't meant to go. But he was powerless to stop himself. He stepped out into the darkness, and as he passed between the doors, they slammed shut behind him. I've never seen them open again like that, and they never opened for him to come back in again either. I glanced at the door to the Dollar General he had chosen to take up residence in, and that was when I noticed something. Someone had piled things in front of the door. Card racks and newspaper racks and other things blocked it, and it was unlikely that it would open and tempt him again. Some of them weren't even in English. Some of them had odd dimensions to them, and it was clear that he had ranged wide to find some of these things. Then Margot got snatched by whatever lurks in the ceiling. I call it the miasma, the thing that came after you in the burnt-out store. Had you seen it before? Once, I said. Bet it was right after you started messing with the ceiling, wasn't it? I nodded guiltily. Rudy and Margot had been looking for a way out as well. They decided they could get out through the roof, but when they took some of the tiles down, they discovered a deep bank of darkness up there. It was just like the stuff outside the door, and when Rudy reached out to touch it, I told him not to. Rudy was a good kid, and he knew better to touch something that I was worried about. The two of them were young enough, though, that when they called me over to see something, I watched as they tossed a tennis ball into the void. They had about 4 empty cans of tennis balls on the floor, and when I asked if they had all gone in, Rudy said they had. When I asked how many had come out, he told me none. I didn't think anything of it, and when he threw the cans up there, none of them came down either. I was settling in, getting ready for bed, Celine already snoozing on the little sectional piece we had pulled in close together, when the lights went out. This was alarming because the lights had never gone out before. The lights stayed on all the time, which was why it was hard to tell what time of the day it was and how long you had actually been here. There was a weird growling noise, and I heard someone scream from out in the darkness. Something fell over then, and I grabbed Celine as the two of us buried ourselves under piles of blankets. I was worried for Rudy and Margot, but at that point in time, I was more concerned with surviving until the lights came back on. Something stomped close to us, making a lot of racket as it pushed things around, but after a while, the lights came on again, and we surfaced to find some shelves shoved over, and a lot of things crushed and smashed. Rudy found us not long after that, saying that he and Margot had seen a monster come out of the ceiling. It had grabbed her, as the two of them had run for the manager's office. And when the lights came back on, he had found the same mess that we had. When I asked him what it looked like, he said it was hard to tell with the lights off. He drew the picture you saw in the break room, and for a while, that was the best description we had of the miasma. Rudy was sullen for a few days, looking at the hole in the ceiling, but I told him to leave it be. It had clearly come out because we had messed with it, and if we left it alone, it would leave us alone. He wanted to go for Margot, said he thought if he went up there he might be able to find her, but I told him to forget about it. We'd lost 2 people already, and the thought of losing my son was difficult to think about. After 3 days, I woke up to find a letter saying he was going to find Margot, and a ladder set up directly under the ceiling. I climbed it, meaning to go in and get him back, but after standing on that top rung and looking into the murk for nearly an hour, I finally climbed back down and put the ladder away. It was just Celine and I after that. We sat in silence for a few minutes, lounging on the padded sectional pieces that I now questioned whether or not had been their sleeping arrangements. "I'm tired," he said, his voice hollow as he lay back. "Let's continue this after some shut-eye." He rolled away from me, facing the chocolate upholstery, but I doubted he slept. At some point I dozed off after trying to ignore his quiet sobbing, and woke up to find coffee, eggs, bacon, and toast. Figured you might want a nice hot breakfast after what we went through yesterday with that thing. Don't worry, it's all scavenged from stores like ours. None of that human meat or weird animal parts or anything. I hadn't thought of that, but it was certainly an interesting concept. As we ate, Gale finished his story. Celine went last, and she may not even be dead. I was distraught after Rudy, just sitting there and feeling sorry for myself. But Celine had been experimenting with the door that we had come through. She told me how she opened it to find another Dollar General beyond that, and when she threw things into it, they came back. I just sat, not taking any of it in, and then one day she came up to me and said she was leaving. I looked up to see that she was wearing a backpack and had put on a floppy garden hat. "Going?" I asked, not understanding. "Going where? Can't go anywhere. We're stuck here. The food's beginning to dwindle, even with just the 2 of us eating. It won't last much longer, and I don't intend to starve here. If that doorway took us here, then it can take us out again, maybe. Come with me. Even if we go somewhere else, it's got to be better than here. There might be food, or maybe Rudy or Margot, or anything. Maybe Kenneth's out there somewhere. I don't know. Either way, if we stay here, we're gonna die. Come with me. We can start over, somewhere else." I wanted to. I really did. But at that point, I was at my lowest. My family had abandoned me. My son had left me too, and now the last of my friends had deserted me. I turned away, saying nothing, and when she left, I just sat there. She never came back, at least not as far as I know, and I've never seen her in any of the other stores I've traveled to. I sat there for a long time, just stewing, but eventually I was down to canned goods and big jugs of water. When the water ran out, I drank from the fountain. When the canned goods ran out, however, I started looking at that door, too. There was food on the other side. I could see it. Without thinking about it, I just stepped through one day. It was brand new Dollar General, fully stocked with food and set up for Christmas, and that was how it all started. I never stayed long in any store after that. I just I just kept moving, hoping I would find Celine or Rudy or anyone. I found a few people, but the ones I found were usually scared or half crazy, and I moved on quickly. One fella, an old guy in a half-destroyed store, stabbed me with pruning shears as I went through his place. He pulled up his shirt then, and I gasped as I saw the spot he pointed to midway up his belly. I didn't see anything, though. Not a scar, not a red mark, nothing. It looked as fresh as new skin, and he laughed when I looked surprised. Luckily for me, it was close enough to the door that I could make it through, and that's when I made my biggest discovery. I fell through the door, grabbed at the shears so I didn't push them in deeper, and found they were gone. So was the wound. You've probably noticed that no matter how ragged your clothes get, they always repair themselves when you pass through the door, right? Well, it's the same with your body. Burns, cuts, stabs, they all heal when you go through the door. I've had all manner of things wrong with me, but a new store always means a new me. We sat there for a few minutes, each of us digesting something different, it seemed. Did you ever find Rudy or Margot or Kenneth? I finally asked, already guessing the answer. It was several minutes before he responded, and I wasn't sure that he would for a minute. Nah. They went beyond the Dollar General beyond. The store protects us, insulates us to a certain degree, but if we go beyond, then we're lost. I've watched the store change over the years. New items added, new layouts and concepts, but I've stayed the same. I was 43 in '98, and I still look exactly the same as I did then. I haven't aged, and neither will you. The store traps us, keeps us like this, plays with us until it inevitably breaks us, and there's nothing we can do about it. He looked sad, but when he turned back, his smile had returned. But, he said, there are things we can do to make it harder for them to break us. Things I can show you. Gale promised to teach me what he knows, and I'm eager to learn. I've shared enough for now, though. Gale's asleep, and I can tell that the tapping of my phone keys is bothering him. I'll update you guys in a little bit. Till then, don't get stuck in the Dollar General beyond either, or we might have to come find you as well. Till next time. My husband Thomas is a writer of short horror, and I'm very proud of him. He crafts these unique little tales about horrific situations, and people really like them. I won't name drop here, but you may have read some of his work if you've been in the community for a while. He writes a lot, and his stories have been read by a lot of different narrators. Recently, though, things have changed. He's been thinking of narrating his own stories for years, but he just never thought he was up to the task. His voice won't play well with the audience, he says. No one will want to hear someone read their own stories, he says. His stories aren't very good, even though he makes money writing them. He has thousands of excuses, but finally I told him to just try it and keep his expectations realistic. He gave it a try, and from the first video, things have been great for him, but very strange for me. You see, when my husband records videos, he becomes someone else. It all started with Dr. Winston and the Hospital of Horrors, a series my husband writes. Dr. Winston is a stuttery little guy, someone who's afraid of his own shadow, and when my husband does his voice, it doesn't even sound like him anymore. I've never actually seen him do the voice. Not really. We have a 2-bedroom apartment, so he sets up his studio in the bedroom since our son has the other room. He bought one of those green screen curtains from Amazon and some wall foam to cut down on the reverb, and he pulls the curtain and sits behind the screen as he works. Sometimes I'll sit in bed and listen, hearing the story unfold, and the first time I heard that whispery little voice come from behind the curtain, I had to get up and peek and make sure it was just him back there. His voices are spectacular, and soon he had a dozen or more of them. Lenny Drover, Dr. Winston, Ozark Uncle, Raymond W. Sanders, Dr. Summer, just to name a few, but it's the Terrifier that I hate to hear. Tommy Terrifier is a reoccurring villain in his story. Tommy is a creature that hunts children after dark, and sometimes leaves them skinned alive beneath trees or on benches or somewhere else where people will find them. He's the antagonist of Corbin Banner, an Atlanta detective, and has become a fan favorite. The people just love the voice he does, the deep, resonating voice that speaks of horrible acts and terrible deeds. I sometimes put my headphones on when he reads stories about Skinner Park, but I find that the voice of Tommy the Terrifier still bleeds through my AirPods. "Don't worry, little one. I'll make it quick. You won't feel a thing. I'll snatch your skin so fast. You won't have time to—" "Stop! Stop! Please, no!" I shouted one evening, and my Thomas threw the curtain back and looked at me in alarm. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" he asked, the chair falling over as he stood up. Yeah, sorry. I must have dozed off and had a nightmare." He snorted and gave me a cuddle, going back to work as I turned up the volume and tried to ignore the horrible voice he used. We went to bed not long after. The audio finished for the evening, but when I woke up sometime later, I saw a light out of the corner of my eye. There was a ghostly glow from behind the curtain, and the edges billowed slightly in the breeze from the AC. He'd left his setup on, the curtain usually covering his workspace, and the chair was lit in the backdrop of the computer screen. I could swear there was something more behind that curtain, but I didn't have my glasses on, and I couldn't see it clearly. As I watched, the chair seemed to glide as it swiveled around. The curtain rustled ever so slightly at the bottom, and behind that gauzy barrier, I could see someone hunched in the chair. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. They saw me seeing them, and when he smiled, it was like bugs on my skin. "Hello, puppet. Fancy a stroll by the old canal?" I felt my breath hitch, my throat cramping as the terror spread through me. It was him. It was Tommy Terrifier. It was him, and he was just beyond the curtain. When he stood up suddenly, his height imposing despite his obvious age, my throat opened and the scream I loosed sounded like a tornado siren. My husband came awake violently, reaching for the bat he kept by the bedside. He believed that there was an intruder, that something had woken me up and scared the hell out of me. He was out of bed and looking for the source of my fear, and when I pointed to the curtain, he looked confused. He pushed the curtain aside with the bat and revealed nothing but the chair and the glowing screen of the monitor. I tried to explain to him what I had seen, but he just kissed my forehead and told me I must have been dreaming. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I found myself watching that curtain, waiting for the creature to return, praying it wouldn't get me if it did. As the sun came up, I finally slipped off, waking up a little later when the smell of lunch being cooked hit my nose. The bed was empty except for me, and Thomas had packed his green screen up after last night's scare. I could hear him in the kitchen, whistling as he cooked something on the stove, and I crawled out of bed as I reached for my robe. It was Sunday, and our son was likely at someone's house, which would leave the two of us the day to ourselves. I would have plenty of chances to rest, the night before already a hazy memory, and as I crept up the hall, I tried to cover my mouth as I got ready to startle him. My husband, for writing such scary stuff, is kind of a fraidy cat. He puts on a spooky deep voice for his videos, but he's a big old scaredy cat in reality. My favorite thing to do is startle him, something I probably do too often, but as I came into the kitchen, he must have heard me. He never looked up from what he was cooking, but I heard a terrifyingly familiar voice just before I reached out to grab him.
"Careful now, puppet. You wouldn't want to startle me at my work."
I don't know if I slipped when my foot came down, but when I hit the floor, I was already backpedaling. I was scooting away, my fear returning, and when he turned to look at me, I could swear his face had changed. Gone was the beard and glasses I'd grown accustomed to, the thin lips and the green eyes I loved. His face was pale and clean-shaven, his skin pockmarked and cratered. His teeth grinned shark-like from his mouth, thin and needle-like, and I screamed and covered my face as he took a step towards me. I flinched and struck out with my fists as he touched me, and when I saw that Thomas was looking down at me with concern, I felt confused. When I saw the trickle of blood coming from his nose, the confusion turned to shame. "Jesus, I'm so sorry. I didn't think you'd react that badly. I didn't mean to scare you. I heard you creeping up on me and thought I'd startle you a little for a change." He apologized as he helped me up, but that was only the beginning. I didn't sit in the bedroom while he recorded anymore, but that wasn't the last time I heard the voice of Tommy Terrifier. I heard it wafting from under the door, inserting itself in my ears as I tried to block it out on the couch in the living room. More terrifying still, I heard it in my husband's voice as he went about his day-to-day life. It was little things at first. Tommy Terrifier had a noticeable British accent, and I began to notice the way my husband pronounced certain words. He never noticed, but there was an inflection on certain words sometimes that made my skin crawl. When I mentioned it to him, he just looked at me strangely and said it must be something he wasn't aware of. Our son, Nathaniel, didn't seem to be able to hear it either, though. When I mentioned it to him, often right after it happened, he would shrug and say that he couldn't hear it. No one but me seemed to be able to hear the odd inflection he put on, and I began to feel like they were both messing with me. The other thing was that he started calling me Poppet. First I thought it was something he was doing on purpose, but when he kept looking at me strangely anytime I brought it up, I began to doubt. It was like he didn't realize he was saying it, and my upset confused him. We were having problems at this point, fighting over my perceived treatment, and his lack of understanding honestly made it worse. The straw that broke the camel's back, though, was the sleep talking. Thomas had never talked in his sleep. He barely even snored, but suddenly he was talking in his sleep almost every night. Well, it wasn't really him talking. It was Tommy Terrifier who was talking to someone as Thomas lay sleeping beside me. He always just called them Poppet, the name Tommy gave the kids in the stories before he killed them, but it was also the name he'd been calling me for weeks now. As I lay there listening to him talk about all the grisly things he meant to do, I realized that he might be talking to me instead of some random kid he was dreaming about. Sometimes he would turn his head and look in my direction, and I could feel his eyes behind his lids looking at me. I wanted to wake him up, but by now I realized it wouldn't do any good. He would just think I was having mental problems or something, and the fights would continue. I moved to the couch that night, and when he found me there in the morning, I told him I was having bad dreams and I didn't want to wake him up. Not long after that, he told me about a new angle for the show. The fans have really been liking the series, especially Tommy Terrifier, thinking about changing the show up so Tommy reads the stories sometimes. I might get more audience interaction, kind of shake up my listeners a little bit. I tried to be supportive of this, but I was not pleased to hear that Tommy would be making more appearances in his makeshift booth. After that, every third or fourth story was narrated by Tommy Terrifier. Then it was every other. As the voice became a regular part of his show, the night talking got worse. He would say the most depraved things I could barely believe my normally sweet husband would say. He would talk for hours about skinning people alive or pulling out their teeth, and I would lie there in terror as it all just played out around me. I'd taken to using sleep meds so I could get to sleep before him, but sometimes that voice would follow me into my dreams, and I would spend my nights in a state of constant terror. Sometimes I couldn't get to sleep before him, but even from the couch, his dark words seemed to find me. I came to realize that this wasn't something he could help, and I stopped bringing it up. He was so excited about his channel that I hated to put a damper on his enthusiasm by telling him how it affected me. Engagement was way up, he would say. He had more subscribers than ever, he would say. People were commenting how much they loved Tommy Terrifier, he would say. Ad revenue was at an all-time high, and maybe he could cut back at work and take more time for the channel, he would say. On and on and on about how people liked that terrifying voice of his, and I would nod and agree and tell him how great it all was. Meanwhile, I was a nervous wreck in my own home, waiting for the next encounter with Tommy. Before long, the show became Tommy Terrifier's Terrifying Tales, and Tommy began to make an appearance in every episode. That's when I began to notice the physical change in Thomas. He was spending more and more time in our bedroom, the door closed and that terrible voice creeping from beneath it. It wasn't just me hearing it now. Nathan had begun avoiding the back of the house, spending more time in the living room than usual when he was at home. I asked him why, but he wouldn't tell me. He said he hadn't been sleeping well lately, and I can relate. He's been sleeping on the couch with me sometimes, and we both shudder when the voice of Tommy Terrifier slips down the hall. That was a week ago. Now the only time he leaves the house is for evening runs. He says it's when he gets his best writing done, but I've come to doubt his words. He always comes back sweaty and disheveled, and his stories have taken a very dark cast. They've become less horror and more horrific. The mutilations and violence have reached a new level, and all of it is delivered by the voice of Tommy Terrifier. He doesn't even sound like himself when the mic is off now. His normal voice has begun to appear less and less, and I'm afraid that one day that pale creature will come out of the bedroom instead. It's getting late now, and though he hasn't come back, the police have come asking questions. They questioned everyone in the neighborhood at the start of the violence, but they had some very probing questions about my husband tonight. Where does he run? When does he run? Had I noticed any strange behavior? Did I notice a change in his personality? Apparently, some of the stories he's been writing lately have been a little too similar to the murders in the park, and the police want to bring him in as a person of interest. I told them he was out running and they could find him in the park. After they left, I put the chain on and waited for him to come back. He hasn't returned, but I woke up to hear a familiar voice coming from the bedroom. It seems there's a new story to be told tonight, and the sounds of Tommy Terrifier sound almost gleeful. I don't know what to do. I'm not even sure how he got back inside. I want to leave, but I'm frozen in fear as I sit on the couch with my son. I don't know if I'm more afraid that the voice will continue or that it will stop. Because if it stops, I'm not sure if I might not become just another one of those tales he reads for his audience every night. So, Daryl, tell me about the dreams you're having trouble with. Daryl looked down into the steam, seeming unsure how to begin. It was a long time ago, you understand. The dreams? Dr. Winter asked, unsure what he meant. No, the thing that happened in the dreams. The dreams are more recent, but they're really affecting my work. I need to sleep so I can be effective at my job, and these dreams are keeping me from getting restful sleep. The steam wafted up from the tea and created condensation on Daryl's glasses, making him appear to be crying in slow drips. Let's start with what happened then. Tell me about it, and maybe we can help you forget it. If you can't remember the trigger, then the dream should stop. Daryl sighed deeply, clearly not wanting to relive it, but willing to try. Well, I guess it all started with this weird obsession I had with other people's houses. When I was a kid, I had kind of a weird obsession with people's houses. It sounds odd, I know, but I always wanted to go into someone's house while no one was there and just, look around. I didn't want to take anything. I wasn't a thief, but I just wanted to look at their stuff and see where they put things. See if they like to keep things a certain way. If they like to keep things the way that I did. And just observe things without, them being there. When people show you their room and their collection of something, or take you somewhere that's special to them, they always get nervous that you'll judge them, and to me, that ruins the experience. I want to observe these things in their purest form, without someone standing behind me to hurry me along before I start to judge them. I can remember wanting to go into people's houses from a very young age. We'd be driving somewhere or on a trip, and I would see an unfamiliar house and just wonder what it was like in there. Did they have a cupboard full of mugs like my mom did? Was there an ashtray in the living room with butts in it? What color was their furniture? Did they collect knickknacks? I would create these little houses in my mind, based solely on the exterior, and never get any closure on how right or wrong I was. I still feel that way. I still want to look, but I'm wiser now. When I wonder now, I remember what happened when I was 11, and I know better than to go snooping. When I was 11, I found a house with an open door. I didn't set out to find the house, you understand. I wasn't casing the neighborhood for a nice house to go sightseeing in. I was on my way home from the corner store with my mom's cigarettes. We lived in a small town, and Mom had bought a pack of Virginia Slims at the same corner store every day for as long as I could remember. The lady at the store, Miss Vicky, had known me since I was in Oshkosh Bagosh overalls. She knew I was more likely to set my hand on fire than smoke one of Mom's cigarettes. So when I put the Skittles and the Yoo-Hoo on the counter and asked her for a pack of Virginia Slim long menthols, please, she put them in a paper bag, along with the change from the 10 my mom had given me. "Tell your mom I said hi," she said, the bell over the door tinkling happily, and I said I would as I took my leave. The trip home was about 10 minutes by foot, and I had drunk the Yoo-Hoo in about 45 seconds into the walk. I tossed it into someone's garbage can, because I wasn't a litter bug, and had just torn open the bag of Skittles when my eyes found something I couldn't remember having seen before. I had walked this road 1,000 times, rode my bike up at half that many, and as I turned to look at the house, I don't think I'd ever seen it before in all that time. It was fluorescent blue, that weird bubble stucco on it that was trendy at the time. It had little square windows and a big metal awning over the top of each to keep the light in to a minimum. The grass was a little tall in the yard, but not unkempt. This was Georgia after all, and if it rained more than twice after you cut it, you had to cut it again. There was no car in the yard, and the whole place just looked very abandoned. And the door was wide open. I stopped with my Skittles in hand, thinking about that door and the idea of exploring a house with no one in it. I'd never been inside a house by myself that wasn't mine, and though I knew I shouldn't, I couldn't imagine another opportunity like this. This could be my only chance. My 11-year-old brain told me that. I might had better take advantage. Well, I could. It further said. I took a step off the road towards the door, then another, and another. Before I knew it, I was in the yard with the tall, tickly tops of the seed pods rubbing at my legs. I looked at the door like it might suddenly slam shut, but with every step that it stayed open, I felt a little more confident that I was making the right decision. I peeked inside and found an empty living room with the TV playing. The light coming in through the windows was enough to show me the dingy living room, but I could tell that it'd be dark in here after the sun went down. The TV was playing a commercial for dog food, and the lights on the screen made me hesitate to enter. Just a quick look at the living room, I told myself. If someone came back from the bathroom or something and found me here, I can say that the door was open and that I was worried. That's a thing a good neighbor would do after all, and so I started quickly looking around at the small square front room. A mustard yellow couch took up one whole wall, and it looked prickly. It was like the couch in my grandma's house, the one in her receiving room, and there was a scratchy throw tossed over the back of it that really brought the whole thing together. There was a divot in the couch, too, right in front of the TV, and it appeared that someone had spent a lot of time making it. On the wall closest to the kitchen was a flimsy bookshelf that held some magazines and paperbacks on the bottom and the middle shelf, and a bunch of those weird-looking figurines on the topmost shelf. I think they were called Precious Moments figures or something, and whoever lived here had about 15 of them, that I could see at least. They had set the ones with animals in them at the front, and I wondered if those were the ones they liked the best. They all looked chipped and second-hand, none of them appearing new, and the kids they depicted looked discolored with age or old cigarette smoke. Speaking of, there was a TV tray next to the couch, and on it was a teetering ashtray full of thick yellow butts. They weren't Virginia Slims, and the filters said Marlboro on them in little gray letters. Someone had made a little mountain out of them, and it looked like if you dropped one into the opening left in the center, it would smoke like a volcano. There were some pictures on the wall, a man fishing with a kid about my age, a man laughing with a group of people at a theme park, and two men working on an old car. They looked too yellow and kind of washed out, though. The frames were dusty, and the glass looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a very long time. As I took these things in, I couldn't help but feel that something was watching me. I kept looking around, preparing to see someone standing there, watching me intrude, but I never saw anyone. It was a feeling, like when you think there's a bug on your arm, or when someone pretends to crack a make-believe egg on your knee. It's just something you feel, but you don't know why you feel it. It's the same sense that kept your ancestors alive, but it's something we've forgotten in our perceived safety. As I finished looking at the living room, no one having come out to challenge me, I decided to go check out the kitchen too. Sometimes in TV shows, people found their neighbors hurt or something, and I wondered if someone had been injured inside and needed me to call an ambulance. That was a lie. I suspected no such thing, but I wanted to see more of the house before I was discovered. I expected any minute to hear a toilet flush or hear a door close and hear the telltale sound of footsteps coming from the back of the house. They would find me in their house and ask what I thought I was doing, or I would run out before they saw me, and that would be the end of my little adventure. But I wanted to see how far I could get before that happened. The kitchen looked a little like the one at my house. The floor was covered in black and white checkered linoleum, but where ours was shiny and often waxed, this one was peeling and faded. The countertops were chipped and dull, the lustrous black formica looking greasy and sticky. There were cans on it, open cans that crawled with little white worms, and there were more in the trash. The label declared it chili, and it looked less like the kind you ate alone and more like the kind you put on hot dogs. There was a light there, a single round globe speckled with fly corpses, but it did little to reach the corners. The corners looked very dark, almost unnaturally dark, and as I walked around to inspect the little table and the mostly empty cupboards, I could feel that same crawling feeling of being watched. The pockets in here were deeper than the ones in the living room, and it was easier to believe that someone might be watching from them. It almost felt like I could see someone in the dark there, but I couldn't be sure as I looked to the next hallway and tried to decide if I dared. The hallway beyond was cast in various stages of shadowy darkness. The first few steps were shadowy, but I could see the still brown carpet that covered the floor. After that, about 5 feet down, however, it was shadowy to the point of being hard to tell what color the walls were. I could see a door midway down the hall, a bathroom I assumed, but beyond that was little more than the inclination of a door. The longer I looked, the more I could feel something staring at me from that darkness, and the less sure I was that I wanted to go in there. The same feeling I had gotten in the kitchen and the living room was back in force, and the longer I stared, the more I felt like I could see something in that darkness. It was human-shaped, though probably not human. It seemed to hang in the murk of that hallway, the dark converging around it as my eyes tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked, for all the world, like a child's interpretation of darkness, the thick squiggles that often decorate a picture of a dark room. I had taken a single step into that hallway, my foot seeming to be gone as it passed from the semi-lighted kitchen to the hall, and I took it back as I backtracked for the living room. I had seen enough to know that satiating my curiosity might be the end of me. I left the door open and ran for my house, not feeling safe until my own door was between me and the unknown entity that resided there. I told my mother what had happened because I honestly didn't know what else to do. Mom was an adult and might very well be able to make sense of it. She would smile and pat my head and tell me how I had been silly and that I shouldn't let my imagination get the better of me. She would explain it in a way that my child's mind could understand, and it would all be okay. Instead, she called the police and asked if they'd do a well check on the house. Mom had been an emergency dispatcher for about 15 years before finally leaving to be a stay-at-home mom, so she knew what to say to get them to go have a look. They said they would, and when Officer Buck came by a few hours later, I just figured he was in the neighborhood and wanted to say hi. He and Mom had been friends since high school, and he and Dad bowled together and were part of the Moose Lodge, so it wasn't uncommon for him to be at the house. I expected he would ask me to go play somewhere so he and Mom could talk about boring stuff, but he asked me to stay today so he could ask me some questions. He wanted to know what I had seen in the house, and how far I had been, and whether I had smelled anything or seen anything that scared me. I told him about the crawly feeling and how it had felt like someone was watching me, and he thanked me for my honesty and said that I had been very brave to try and check on something like that, but in the future, if I suspected somebody might be in danger, I should call the police station and tell someone. Mom walked him to the door not long after that, and they whispered about something while I went and watched cartoons in the living room. I had already basically forgotten the fear and uncertainty I'd felt in that house, I was a kid, and nothing ever lasted for very long in my mind. I had already moved on to more important things, like Mum-Ra's latest scheme on Thundercats, or how Cobra was going to destroy the G.I. Joes. Mom came and sat with me on the couch then, hugging me a little as she stroked my hair, but I didn't think anything of that either. They bulldozed that house a few weeks later. I watched them destroy it from the seat of my bike. My friends called out to me, wanting me to come and ride with them, but I was trapped by the sight of that strange house as it was flattened. It was weird to realize that you might be the last person to truly see and experience a place, though I would learn I was far from the last many years later. I'd been having some weird dreams lately, and that was the only reason I remembered it at all. I walked through a house I didn't know, my vision seeming to be on rails as I moved effortlessly through the dingy space. I saw a living room with a TV showing snow, a kitchen with counters covered in dark brown juice, and then stopped at a pitch-black hallway. There was something in there. I could feel it, and as it zoomed in, I could hear a high-pitched ringing beginning to build until I finally woke up. I asked Mom about it, figuring she might remember. She got this look on her face that made me instantly regret asking. I was hoping you'd forgotten about that. Your Uncle Buck was afraid it might traumatize you, but I told him it seemed like you really hadn't seen anything. I didn't. Not really, I said, not sure what to say. But I definitely felt something in that house, something that scared me. What was in there? Why did they tear it down all of a sudden? The man who lived there was a shut-in. He paid someone to go get his groceries and to cash his Social Security checks, and basically never left the house. Buck said when we called for a well check, they went in and found him dead in the back room. He said the flies were so thick that the EMTs were having trouble getting him out. They were in the corner of every room, and they were a real nuisance. They had to demolish the house because the room had a lingering smell, and the flies just never quite stopped gathering there. I was glad she'd told me, but I wasn't entirely sure what to do with that information. As the dreams get more persistent, I'm not sure how best to get past them, and every night it's always the same. As he finished, Daryl opened his mouth and let the spongy mass slip into his coffee cup. He sat placidly for a few minutes, blinking his eyes very quickly, and Winter took the opportunity to whisk the cup away before he came to. She added the contents of the cup to a mason jar, washing the cup and setting it by the sink before seating herself and staring at Daryl expectantly. He would assume that he was coming out of a trance, just as she wanted, and he wouldn't question much, besides whether or not it had worked. Humans were far too eager to forget the things that brought them pain in one form or another, something that Dr. Winter used to pay her bills and live very comfortably. Daryl shook his head 30 seconds later and looked around. "What happened?" he asked groggily. "We succeeded in freeing you from your burden. Don't think about it too much. It might hurt you more in the long run if you do." She was showing him the way out when her phone rang. Winter looked down and saw it was Juliet, her receptionist, and picked it up on the third ring. She was probably letting her know that the next client was here. Business had been busy lately, and Winter had never been happier for clients to help. Rent was going up next month on the office. The summer months were always more expensive on the electric bill, and fancy dinners did not, as a rule, pay for themselves, no matter how cute your girlfriend was. "Dr. Winter, someone's here to see you. Someone who isn't on the list." Pamela furrowed her brow. "Tell them that without an appointment I can't help them to..." But the door opened as a man in a dated suit walked into her office. Juliet was right behind him, telling him that he had to fill out forms and insurance papers. But Winter gritted her teeth as she told the fiery receptionist that it'd be okay. Tell my next client I'll reschedule them for first thing tomorrow, and it'll be free." "Free?" Juliet asked, looking shocked. "Free," Winter repeated. "Apologize profusely, but tell them I have an emergency that's come in, and I must take it." Juliet nodded, closing the door behind herself as the man in the pinstripe suit took a seat on her client's couch. "Such generosity," he commented, grinning hugely at her as he rested his leg on his knee. "No such luck. You'll pay me for the lost time and trade, as is fair." When he smiled again, the gold of his glasses seemed to glimmer. "How little you have changed over the years, sister." Dr. Pamela Winter shook her head, unimpressed with the so-called untouchable figure that was the warden of Stragview prison. "I have changed much, brother. It is you who have changed little. Get to the point, please. Like you, I have other matters to attend to."